a little bit longer.
No, I just wanted to understand when it sunsets, how that works.
Okay, we're going to get started, and welcome to the workshop for November 28th, 2023. It is 10 o'clock. Our first presentation is the ESC presentation. Mr. Connor, if you'd like to introduce our guest today.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's my honor to introduce Exceptional Learning Solutions, Dr. Bambi Lockman and Todd Zolik, who are here as a part of an agreement that this board made in terms of a programmatic review of our ESC department. Prior to my arrival, the board approved that contract with Exceptional Learning Solutions. And over the course of several months, I think beginning in September, this process started that gave a deep dive into our ESC department. And there were some great findings that came through as a result of that review. And we have our representatives here today, Bambi and Todd, who are going to walk us through those findings and recommendations. And we look forward to this as a part of the blueprint for our upcoming refresh strategic plan about how we can deliver exceptional service in our exceptional education department. So I'll hand it over to you, and you may begin. Thank you.
Thank you.
And actually, really quickly, because I know our team, this is a high priority, and so I want to, you just let us know as far as cadence, because I want to ensure that they have the opportunity to ask questions throughout, but you know how you're presenting better, so if you just give us some cues on that.
So let me just start with that. It might be best, if it's okay with all of you, to let us finish the presentation, and we have ample time at the end to ask questions and make sure we've covered all the information, if you don't mind doing that.
Yes, and Madam Chair, we did a lot up to 3 hours for this, so I think that should be plenty enough time, hopefully. Yep.
Okay.
All right, thanks.
Thank you. Madam Chair and school board members and Superintendent Connor, we certainly appreciate the opportunity to speak with you this morning. We've had a rare opportunity to be in your school district with some exceptional people. And I don't use that word lightly, because they were outstanding. We had an opportunity to be with your staff. We had an opportunity to, move this forward, to be with not only the district, but your administrative staff throughout the schools, speak with teachers, be a part of your exceptional student education arena in 11 different schools throughout this district. It was an honor. We appreciated their candor. We appreciated the open communication and the support to be able to review this process and to strengthen special education in your district. So thank you to all of you, and especially to the participants who withstood us. But no, truly it was an honor, and they were very welcoming. This morning, as we work through, I want to just remind you of what our purpose and our scope was when we first started this process. We were engaged to do a very thorough, complete analysis of your special education services, the structure, and the practices within the district. The purpose was to provide a systemic, thorough, and comprehensive evaluation of special education, and to make sure that we were looking not only at the programs, but our systems, our personnel, what roles they had, and where their roles met in the course of student education, making sure we looked at what was happening in terms of academics, what was happening within the special education classrooms. And in addition to that, we spent time with you in June, September, and October. So we were actually through the first week of October with our site visits. We did on-site visits. We did staff surveys as well as staff interviews. We did parent surveys and parent meetings, classroom observations. We did a comparison to your practices in conjunction with best practices. We did an analysis of the strengths and your areas of improvement, not only in terms of academic, but in terms of how we support and provide resources for students in exceptional programs, and to make sure that we've looked at the whole continuum. I'm looking at the wrong clicker, sorry. We've spoken to you previously about our methods of review, and this is the full continuum of methods of review. We think that we have a very sound and proven process in terms of coming to our foundation that we'll talk about in a few minutes. But these were all the areas that served as a basis. You know, what happens in terms of your continuum of service? What happens in terms of the data? What does an IEP process look like? We met with key stakeholders across the board, and we interviewed lots and lots of people. And I have to tell you, those interviews were excellent. People were glad to talk to us. They wanted to share. They knew we were coming, and they were very open about their discussions with us across the board. Oh, wrong one. Sorry, wrong clickers. Too many. So based on our interviews and based on our methods of review, that gave us the framework for the report and the 10 categories that you all have had an opportunity to review within that report, so that we cover every aspect that came to the forefront within the report itself. So this morning we're going to cover each of the recommendations with you, give you a little bit of background, reference you back to a few charts, and provide a complete overall overview. So Todd's going to cover the first recommendation as we shift forward.
Great. Well, thank you very much. So our first category that we addressed in this report was the ESE department and the organization thereof. So the way we will handle this moving forward is, in our presentation, you'll see that we list out each recommendation. We'll summarize those, and in parentheses in the slides, you'll see that there is a date, a time frame, I should say, after that. For example, in 1.1, it's 6 months. That is actually reflects back on the proposed timeline that we put in the report as well, just so you have that reference point in the presentation. First of all, we'll take a look at recommendation 1.1. And that is the proposed organizational chart that we put forward for the ESE department. And I'm going to move forward and take a look at that. We'll come back to the actual recommendation. But if you look at this org chart that we have proposed, obviously the superintendent is leading the district, along with the chief of staff and the chief academic officer reporting directly to the superintendent, as it is currently. The areas that you see in this chart that are highlighted in yellow are new positions that we're recommending. The positions that are highlighted in green are existing positions, but are reporting to a different individual currently. So as we look at this, one of the areas that, as we went through the district, we looked at was the notion that in a district of this size, having an executive director running an ESE department is a little bit unusual to do that. There's a lot of responsibilities here in this ESE department, and especially with our proposal of moving the Student Services Department within that as well. We recommend that there's a Chief of Pupil Services, Chief of Pupil Support Services in that role to lead the district. As a practical matter, we also believe that that is someone that, as you're out recruiting for a position, you will have more attention and more interest in that role at that type of a level, rather than having someone come in as an executive director level. In many cases, the caliber of person that you would want would be taking a step down, both in position and in compensation, and it might be hard to find an excellent candidate for that role. Underneath the Chief of Pupil Support Services, we still recommend an Executive Director position, but this would change slightly to an Executive Director of ESE and Student Services, moving the Student Services under the Chief Academic Officer, and we'll get into the details of why we recommend that in a few moments. But primarily, when we look at some of the roles and responsibilities of that Student Services Department, a big part of that is MTSS, and while that's not specifically ESE, of course, it is closely related, both directly and indirectly, and it is something that we'll discuss in more detail in a moment, but that is an area that we need to address and explore some improvements there. Having that academic role under the Chief Academic Officer is something that we believe is a good fit. It makes sense for the district and is something that will strengthen your program. Reporting to that Executive Director of ESE and Student Services, again, these three positions are not new positions, they're existing ones, but they're now reporting to that Executive Director of ESE and Student Services, rather than separate Executive Directors for two different departments. First of all, the Director of Preschool is a role that we don't have no recommendations to change. That is a role that is currently in place, and we don't see any reason to make any adjustments there. The Director of ESE, you currently have two directors in that role now. We believe that it would be a good fit to collapse that into one director level position, since we do have the Executive Director of ESE and Student Services as well. That will be an efficiency for you all in the district. And then, of course, the Director of Student Services would also report up to that Executive Director as well. That would be, again, a move from the current location. Underneath the Director of ESE, that individual would be responsible for two existing positions, which would be the Program Specialists and the ESE Liaisons. We'll talk a little bit more about those two roles in a moment, but then there's also another role of the Compliance Liaisons, which would be a new position in our proposal. Let's talk just briefly about these three positions, because I think it's important as we set the stage for the remainder of our conversation this morning that we have a full understanding of that. So program specialists as they exist right now are valuable in this district, very, very valuable. They have an important role, but as we met with, we met with each of them, as we had conversations with them and watched them in action in schools, we observed that while they're very skilled, both in their knowledge of education practices and in compliance, they were spending a majority of their time on compliance issues. And what we like to see in that type of a role is that those program specialists really overseeing the academic growth and achievement of students. That is where their strength should be, that is where their emphasis needs to be, especially when we look at some of the achievement gaps that we uncovered in the district here and that you all, I believe, probably knew about already. When we look at the ESE liaison roles, also a very valuable role in this district, and in fact, at least one in every school building in the district, which is wonderful and something that many districts don't have. So you should be pleased with yourselves for that and commend you for having that role. It is an important role. Again, that's a position, though, that we would expect to see as someone in each of the buildings really involved in the classroom on a day-to-day basis, coaching, mentoring, providing support, maybe even training and professional development if appropriate. And those ESE liaisons, many of whom, again, not their fault, but many of whom never left their office because they were simply tied up with compliance issues throughout the day. And again, please don't misunderstand. Compliance is vitally important, but compliance needs to be happening in any school district in the background. It cannot be the sole focus. Academic achievement of our students, especially our special needs students, needs to be our primary concern. And having those ESE liaisons out of their office in the classrooms working on a daily basis is going to provide a tremendous amount of value to you as a district and really begin to address some of those areas of need when we talk about student achievement and academic achievement for our special needs students. As a result of that, the compliance piece is still necessary, of course. And so our recommendation is to develop a new role as you're able to and as your budget allows for compliance liaisons. That's not necessarily a position that would be in every school building. That is a role that you could have similar to the program liaisons who would oversee or be responsible for several schools. But again, that person would be solely focused on compliance so that we don't have that muddying of the waters between I need to focus on student achievement, but yet I have all this paperwork to do for compliance. If we separate those two out and we have compliance liaisons that can focus solely on that, they can dedicate their time in that and can become more efficient within that role. We then have the ESE liaisons rather, and the program specialists who can really spend more of their time focused on academic achievement for our students and narrowing that achievement gap. So I'm going to go back. That is our proposed org chart, and so that's something to keep in mind as we're going through the rest of this presentation, because you'll hear some things that are interrelated to that as we go through. Recommendation 1.2 is addressing the climate and culture issues within the special education in Sarasota. One of the things that when we visited schools and talked with staff members and both at the administrative levels and on the front lines in the classrooms, we uncovered some areas of concern around trust and also around lack of visibility. And so when you look at the survey results of our staff members that we surveyed, we had a lot of folks who thought very highly of the communication and involvement of their building leadership, but not so much at the district level. And that's natural, right? We're seeing our building principals every single day, so they're in our sight line. We're interacting with them on a regular basis. Department on the district level is a little bit further removed, not someone you see every single day and so forth. And that's really even more important to establish that trust and that communication piece, which is something that has not been as strong as it could be in the past. When we look at the visibility piece, we think that's really important as well. Having district-level administrators in school buildings has great value. Not saying that's not happening now, but oftentimes that's happening more for when there's a big issue, whether it's a behavior issue, whether it's a compliance issue, whether it's in a high-profile IEP meeting, whatever the case may be. We're going more to put out the fires than we are to be there on the day-to-day basis of seeing what's happening. We really want to make sure that we're developing that culture of communication and transparency with our staff members, making sure that we're not directing them, but we're instead explaining to them the why and the how of what's being done, so that they have a full understanding of what they're doing. We can certainly get a lot more mileage out of our team members if we in fact do simply that. We're transparent and we make sure that we're providing that. One more, please. The recommendation 1.3 is specifically related to the communications plan. One of the things that the department currently does is there is communication. I don't want to suggest that there's not. There is communication, but it's not as regular and not as succinct as we'd like to see. One of the things that at the beginning of the school year, we do have in this district some time for professional development and training and so forth that the ESE department does. What we would like to see, though, is a real school year kickoff meeting for the special education team where we can really talk a little bit about the vision for that school year, where instead of just providing professional development and training, really set the stage for the school year and where that's going. And that could happen at an annual meeting. We also believe that in-person quarterly meetings are important as well. These are things that, again, we can discuss new initiatives. We can help explain that how and why of the changes and policies and procedures that we're putting in place on a quarterly basis. That's not currently happening on a regular basis. We'd also like to see more of a regular newsletter type communication as well, where that's coming out. It doesn't have to be lengthy. We're not expecting a book or anything like that, but we'd certainly like to see those updates and so forth, so that we're not eating up time in staff meetings and so forth by discussing those types of things, but also giving folks updates on policies and procedures and so forth, both at the district level and from the state and national level if applicable as well. And finally, we really want to have that communication process for rolling out new initiatives. We oftentimes will hear this, and not just here in Sarasota, but in many districts, that the folks on the front lines are the last ones to know what's going to happen. And while that's going to naturally occur because it's those initiatives are coming down from central office, the reality is, though, with a little bit of a planned rollout for new initiatives and so forth, we can make that communication more open, more appropriate, and something that staff members will be able to understand, see coming, and so when it is their turn to implement that, they'll feel more comfortable with that. Bambi, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Thank you. Category 2 is staffing, and recommendation 1 primarily deals with the new staffing formula that we're considering that you develop. It's apparent to us that your current staffing plan for special education in some respect is a one-size-fits-all, but it's not. It's a little antiquated, and it does not meet the needs of a structured staffing plan that really provides direction. We think that this new formula needs to be developed in conjunction with building administrators, working collaboratively with them, the ESE department, human resources, and the chief financial officer. And we see this as a quick fix. That it's something that I think people have enough knowledge and background, and I think there are a lot of people out there, as we've looked around, that are willing to step up to the table and to try to move this forward before you get into staffing for next school year. Recommendation 2.2 is about creating job postings that are a little bit more clear and accurate. Job postings have a tendency over time to become very thin. And I say thin in terms of the fact of the content. Job postings really should describe to the person what the position is that they're hired for, what they're looking at, what our level of expectation is for us. And we think that that's something that is also an easy fix for the district and moving that forward. This is extremely important when you're looking even at your para positions, that people really understand what it is that they're applying for and what population of students, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. In addition to that, you do some outreach with universities, but we're recommending that you expand the outreach to really pull from your universities and some of your other sources to help really get prime candidates and be on the forefront of hiring exceptional students for our exceptional teachers for our exceptional students. And then in addition to that, making sure that you have mentoring programs, but they're not strong enough at this point in time. Every new hire in this district needs a mentor, whether that be a classroom teacher or whether that be a paraprofessional. They need to have a mentor, and there needs to be a way for them not only to access that mentor, but for them to meet on a regular basis so that they have the opportunity to really grow as professionals in their current position. The recommendation 2.3 is considering your incentive pay, and we're excited to be able to support this. We heard a lot of discussion about incentive pay when we first came in, and the district is ahead of the game on that. But we think that there are special education staff in the district that, while they're provided additional compensation, that we need to really be looking at schools like Oak Park. Oak Park is a separate day school. The level of expectation for a para in Oak Park is very different than the level of expectation in many of our schools. Not to say that our paras don't work hard in all of our schools, they do, and they are phenomenal. But I think that when you look at a separate day school, and we've discussed this and really thought hard about it, that maybe there doesn't need to be a discrimination in classification anymore. Maybe we need to be looking at one classification so that you don't have an SSP 5 and a 7, that maybe you're looking at a 7 for all employees. And so that there isn't that discrepancy, it makes it more equitable in terms of their compensation. And we believe that you'll be able to gain growth and stability within that support system for your students. Recommendation 2.4 is to make sure that in your job descriptions you're describing, and I referred to this a while ago, your paraprofessionals, what that actual job description is. But it goes beyond that. During the interview process, we're suggesting that you look at onboarding, and we've seen this very successful. So this means that the individual comes in to the district, applies for the job, you think they're a viable applicant, you kind of give them an idea of what their job specifically would be and what kind of site it would be, and then you hire them and pay them compensation to come to training and be onboarded for a week prior to stepping foot in that school. This gives them an opportunity not only to get robust training and to make sure that they're trained in CPI or whatever that you're using at that point in time. Maybe they go on site and actually look at the school, look at the location, and at that point say to you, you know, this isn't my skill set, do you have another opportunity for me? You don't want paras walking out the door day one, and you certainly don't want them walking out the middle of a week, and that's what happens. And if you look at data, no matter what, whether it's Sarasota or other districts, that's what's happening in many places because they're not equipped, they're not well informed. And we think that you can prevent that by making sure that you do solid onboarding with your paraprofessionals. Todd?
Next category we're discussing is finance and budgeting. There is a few things contained in here that we think are important to point out. When we look at IDEA funding, as all of you know, you all sign off on it. There is an IDEA budget that is requested of the state and ultimately the federal government, and so you get those funds that come in, and those funds are intended to be used for special education, and they are. The challenge that we see in this district, when we took a look at your budget and went through that budget, is that we see over the years, and our review went back 5 years. We didn't go back farther than that, but over the last 5 years, when we look at that budget, and I'll just throw it up here for you as well to take a look at, in that top chart, the first line there is the actual federal grant revenue that was received, the IDEA funding that the district received. When we start back at the far right in 2019, you'll see that there was a gap in funding there of about $879, I believe it was $878,000. And we sometimes see that in school districts, where we see that we're pulling money from the general fund to cover some special education expenses. That's not necessarily unusual if we have new curriculum coming in, if we need particular equipment or what have you. We'll see that. That's not necessarily an unusual thing. Where it becomes a little bit unusual is we see that year over year, where that continues to happen. And not only does it happen year over year, that's expanding year over year. So we're now pulling more money out of the general fund to cover our special education programming that the IDEA grant isn't funding any longer and isn't sufficient to fund. Again, if we saw that as a small amount on an annual basis, that might be something that wouldn't raise eyebrows. But when we see, and you look at that chart, that graph rather, below, you see that's a pretty exponential increase on an annual basis, year over year, of that trajectory of an increase coming out of the general fund to cover IDEA and student ESE services. Excuse me. That's something that needs to be considered. The question becomes why, and is that we are not sufficiently putting together our IDEA grant application? That could be a possibility. We also know that we have expanding costs. There's no doubt about that in special education and everything else. But that type of a trajectory, when you see that going up $1 million plus nearly every year since 2020, that's a cause for concern. That's something that needs to be examined, and we need to look a little bit deeper why that's the case. Go back one. There we go. The recommendation 3.2 is really, it's more of a cautionary tale, I guess, than anything else, and it's something that we wanted to bring to the board's attention. I'm sure that we know that your superintendent and his team are well aware of this, but it's something that we think is important for you all as board members to know as well, and you probably already do, is that the ESSER dollars that we received as a result of the COVID-19 are coming to an end. It truly is a cliff at this point, at the end of this school year. Many times when we have federal grants, we see a step-down process. That is not the case here. It is an abrupt stop at the end of this school year. You have almost $800,000 that you've been receiving over the years on an annual basis in those. And the district in the past made a decision to use most of those dollars for staffing. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's not inappropriate per se. It didn't violate anything. However, it is problematic now. Now we have folks who have been in the schools for several years, who are embedded in the practice and the life of that school, who are, one of two things are going to be the case. Either those positions are going to need to be eliminated, or the districts are going to need to reallocate resources to cover those positions. Neither of which is a great option. And so our recommendation here is really more of something for you all as a board to consider moving forward. That as we look at federal grants, we should be living within our means, not covering staffing, but instead utilizing those dollars to for any number of things. But when there's a cliff involved, not having staffing as a part of that. Process. Got it? Oh, thank you. Mm-hmm. Okay, perfect. The next category, number 4, revolves programmatic offerings and continuum of services. Continuum of services is something that I think is really important, and we're going to get into that in depth in this section. And I know you all have already read that as well. First of all, recommendation 4.1 involves MTSS. We talked a little bit about that with the Student Services Department. One of our concerns when we looked at MTSS, and I'm certain you all are familiar with the MTSS process. We have 3 tiers. Tier 1 is for students who are in our general all 3 are in general education populations. Tier 1 is about 80% of our students. They're receiving the general supports and services that you would expect to see in a classroom setting. Tier 2 is for those students who need a little bit more support. Additional interventions, additional support services, whatever the case may be that those individual students might need. And of course, Tier 3 is then if those Tier 2 services are not sufficient, then we move on to Tier 3 and provide some additional supports, some different supports to try to address those student needs. What we're seeing when we look around the district here is that MTSS Tier 1 is operating just fine in this district. Tier 2, we have a Tier 2 system, but it's not necessarily consistent. We see different types of Tier 2 operations in different school buildings. Some places have a very robust Tier 2 MTSS process in place. Others, it's virtually non-existent. And that inconsistency from one building to another is problematic. That should be something that's consistent throughout the district and something that all students are receiving. Now, when I say consistent throughout the district, I mean the level of service, not the individual services, just to be clear. When we move on to Tier 3, there are places where, again, Tier 3 does exist and is being utilized. There are also instances that we saw where Tier 3 really isn't even existing in a meaningful way. We're moving from Tier 2 to a recommendation for special education services. We're skipping out on that Tier 3 altogether. That's problematic and troubling because that leaves that MTSS system with an entire hole in it that's really an important component for meeting the needs of those students. When we looked at MTSS and we looked at the Student Services Department, one of the things that we realized and one of the recommendations that we have to move them under the Chief Academic Officer is specifically related to this MTSS piece. And that is an academic piece. It is something that is important for the Chief Academic Officer to oversee. It is something when we talk with staff at the Student Services Department, when they say no one here is overseeing MTSS, that's problematic in our minds. Someone does need to be overseeing MTSS, and it's something that needs to be happening on a regular basis. So that is one of our recommendations there. Our recommendation 4.2 is really looking at an instructional model that provides a true continuum of services. When we think about a continuum of services, well, let's actually step back from that. When we talk about special education is a service. If we go back several decades, special education was a place. It was a place, it was a classroom down the hall where we sent those students who needed help. Go over there and get help. That's not what special education is. It's a service. In this district, you've worked very, very hard to eliminate that concept of the old-fashioned notion of sending kids over there to get services. We do have services that we're providing for special needs students, and that's important to call out and to point out. However, when we think about a continuum of services, it truly is a continuum. We have on one side the most restrictive environment for those students who need a lot of attention and a lot of help, all the way over to the least restrictive environment. When you look at our philosophy as a country on special education, the move is to move to the least restrictive environment for our students. That's what we all want as educators, we want as parents. Everyone wants that. We want our students to be educated alongside their peers. However, all that being said, that's not always possible, not always doable. The spectrum means that we meet the students where they are in that spectrum. That means you're going to have some students who need that most restrictive environment. You'll have some students who can function absolutely fine in that traditional classroom setting. And they can integrate in there and be part of that. And of course, you have students somewhere in the middle as well. The challenge that we saw here in this district is that the way the continuum should work is that we identify students where they are in that continuum, and then we provide the supports and the interventions as needed to meet the students where they are in the continuum. What we saw a lot of in our classrooms and school buildings is we found programs, and we put the students into the programs rather than the other way around. Programs are supposed to find the students, not students finding programs. Otherwise, we're putting potentially square pegs in round holes, and that just doesn't work for our kids. So we need to take a look at that and really and look at that continuum and make sure that we are meeting students where they are on that continuum and providing the appropriate services for them. Again, I mentioned the self-contained classrooms. We are not suggesting, and please understand this, that we should move back to a notion of self-contained classrooms. We believe fully, as this district has done and should be commended for doing, it is the policy in this district to move students into the least restrictive environment for full inclusion. That is the policy. That is absolutely acceptable, and we think that's fantastic. But the reality is not every student can operate successfully in a fully integrated classroom. Self-contained classrooms and self-contained environment are important and necessary for some students. That's not to suggest we need them in every school. It's not to suggest we should be throwing our students into those types of situations. But it does matter for some students, and we need to recognize that we can't move all students into that full inclusion classroom and expect them to be successful. Recommendation 4.4 is really involving middle school specifically. One of the things that when we look at that continuum, it's a continuum of services throughout the student's educational career as well, and not just on their needs. And when we look at your district specifically, we see that in the elementary years, in early elementary and in elementary school, we see very robust services. We see a lot of students who are getting their needs met. They're having individually, very structured and individually designed services to get that. And they're getting those wonderful services throughout elementary school. And when those students go into middle school, the challenge there is that those students are being mainstreamed into full inclusion classrooms. There is no other option for middle school students other than to go into mainstreamed full inclusion in their middle school setting. The only option for that is to move students to Oak Park or to move them to other separate day schools outside of district. That's not okay. That is something that middle school students, for most cases, should be in their middle school classrooms, middle school building settings. We need to be able to provide the appropriate middle school services in those classrooms, because when those students move out of middle school into high school, those services are back, and we have that. We have a missing middle in that in that piece, and that is an area that is something that we need to make sure we're providing that continuum of services throughout the student's educational career, from preschool and kindergarten all the way through 12th grade, making sure that we're not missing those middle school students along the way, but making sure that we're still providing the supports that they need on an individualized basis.
Thank you. Category 5 is policies and procedures. And when you look at exceptional student education, that is definitely the core and the foundation for much of which we abide by. So recommendation 5.1A is to make sure that we have a regimen of ongoing comprehensive professional development. Todd and I both have talked to you about the program specialists, the liaisons, the consideration of changing their roles. But the truth of the matter is, role change or not, there's never enough training for somebody that's in that kind of position. The IDEA hasn't changed. Most of the eligibility criteria has not changed. But the consistency by which we implement those is not there. And there has to be consistent training and ongoing training and onboarding of new people moving into new positions. They need to understand the culture in each of the schools they're assigned to. They need to understand the community by which they're serving in that process. And so this training is extremely important. It's important, and your district staff and your school-based staff need to have an opportunity to do that same kind of training, whether it be just on what does an eligibility criteria look like, how is it interpreted, or on the high end of the spectrum, what are the legal ramifications if we don't follow this process? And you all are unfortunately not unfamiliar with those legal processes. Other districts have legal issues too, but it's by the way that we conduct ourselves on a day-to-day basis and making sure that we have a consistent process that we prevent some of those issues from happening. So it's that quality IEP development in conjunction with leadership training on customer service. Our IEPs are very intense. We know when to call in backup. That's not anything that people don't know. But the point is, we have to know how to deal with the customers up front so that we don't necessarily have to have that kind of an outcome. Recommendation 5.1B is to eliminate the practice of predetermination of placement, to alleviate a violation of free, appropriate public education. So let's talk about that. Nobody intentionally makes a predetermination. But when we have meetings, sidebar meetings, or that we don't think we have a place for a student to go, and we haven't made those decisions at the IEP table, then we're predetermining. And we cannot meet the needs of every child at every school. There has to be options on that continuum that Todd talked about. But that predetermination is probably one of the biggest violations that a district can make in terms of free, appropriate public education, and that has to be eliminated. We have to discontinue the practice of misidentifying students to avoid that EBD label, educationally behaviorally disturbed. So let's talk about emotionally behavior disturbed, excuse me. So let's talk about that. Every district in the state of Florida has rules that they have to follow, and we have to look at disproportionality. And Sarasota, not uncommon to other districts in the state of Florida, had an issue at one time with disproportionality. But the fact that you have that issue and it takes you a while to rectify it doesn't mean that you then decide not to label students appropriately if they are emotionally behaviorally disturbed and they meet that eligibility criteria. This process has to be reviewed and evaluated. The IEP and the placement of OHI and your other health impaired, and then your ASD, your autism spectrum students, are currently being served in EBD settings. What that says is that uncharacteristically, you have a very low number of EBD students because we're not identifying them, and you have a very high number of other health impaired with a close second on ASD. If you look at the chart that's up here on the board, these are the number of EBD students per cluster school. You have 8 cluster schools, and the highest number of any EBD population in any of those schools is at Northport with 22. But it seems a little out of sync when you look at the other numbers and you know that you have cluster sites that should be serving that. Now, there are other populations of students that do have behavior issues. So I'm not going to sit here and say that maybe, there are students in those units that shouldn't be. But when you walk into a unit that's specifically for EBD students and you see either 0 EBD students or all ASD students, and maybe a mix of OHI, there's something that's not right in that process. If we don't need that many EBD units, and we just need behavioral processes, that's different. The other thing that's impacted in this process is the student's IEP. What an ASD student needs to manage their behavior and their curriculum is very different than what a student with emotional problems needs in their curriculum and their unit. So that's a hard look at something that has to change as we go forward in time. Thank you. Recommendation 5.1C is to make sure that we have oversight and supervision for our BCBAs, our behavior personnel. BCBAs have a tough job, and they are hard to retain. So as we continue to support them and encourage them to stay with the district, to supervise them, and to give them adequate support and ongoing training, whether that be through maintaining the personnel we have or encouraging personnel that we have maybe to go and get their certification as a BCBA. They know our kids, so why wouldn't we invest in them and train them to become BCBAs? And if that doesn't work, then districts have gone to outsourcing. And they sometimes can find the numbers to meet their level of expectation for that population. So I think it's very important with the growing demands of this district. It's not going to get smaller. It's growing every day. Those are considerations that you need to make. School-based and district administrators and Oak Park. So that's recommendation 5.1D. This is one thing that was a big aha for us. Not shocking, but a big aha, that we have school-based administrators out there and throughout the district that think they know what happens at Oak Park. They have one concept of what that is. They also think they know what a cluster site looks like at their neighboring school. Student doesn't fit in my school, so he must have to go to Oak Park. Student doesn't fit in my school, he must have to go to a behavior cluster. Our recommendation is that administrators need to be required, and I know we can't always require, but required, yes you can, sir, thank you. I can't, you can, yes sir. There you go. To visit Oak Park, not just to do a walkthrough, live and breathe in Oak Park for a few hours a day. Live and breathe in that cluster unit that's at my neighbor's school to see whether or not the kid I'm getting ready to say, no, he needs to go there, really needs to go there. And have we gone that extra mile in our school to meet that student's behavioral issues? That is core and essential. And I appreciate the superintendent's support because I think that it will change the face of how we're placing students in units more appropriately. 5.2, you have a strong asset in this district called a pre-K diagnostic team. We've had an opportunity to talk to some of them and to look at the value that they bring to the district. But we think that role should be expanded with a more permanent team here at the central office to handle those out-of-state and out-of-county transfers, to deal with those private school evaluations, those difficult-to-test students, and to eliminate those partial documents going from here to the school. If we could establish, if you could establish a system here to take on that population and reduce the numbers that the school-based evaluation caseloads have to take on, then I think you would have a win-win situation because everything would come in one package to Ms. Marinelli's school. They would be ready to staff, and they would be ready to place. In addition to that, the appropriate people are available in one location to do those kind of outside processes, and the school would only be dealing with those kids that actually come through an MTSS process or need to do reevaluations. And that eliminates some of the back and forth. It means that you've got to realign some of your existing ESC processes, and it means that you've got to look at your ESC transfer student checklist and realign it also. All right, Category 6, Curriculum and Instruction. We went into some very good classrooms, and we went into some classrooms where they were struggling. And that's not unusual to Sarasota. But what is unusual is that it does not appear that there are curriculum frameworks in place for exceptional student education. Not strong curriculum framework, not curriculum framework that you can identify if you go to a North End school and see the same thing at the South End school. Now, obviously, there's a uniqueness to special education, and some curriculums have to vary. We get that. But at the same time, those frameworks, those curriculum subject areas, the teacher's use of the curriculum framework in the classroom needs to be more consistent. And there needs to be that opportunity for curriculum committees to actually formally put that together so that it's in place. Establishing standards and parameters for appropriate curriculum materials and interventions, provide training to special ed teachers, paraprofessionals, and staff on curriculum that have been adopted to be used. We have classrooms that are of the opinion, unfortunately, that an intervention, some kind of tool is the same as curriculum. And that can't be the situation. Orton Gillingham has a great program. You have that in your district, but it's an intervention. There are curriculum standards and curriculum frameworks that need to be in place in order to support those interventions. The recommendation 6.3, and we're kind of stealing the superintendent's idea here, so I just apologize. We'll borrow it, okay? But we believe that after those curriculum frameworks are in place and there's time for things to be more established, that you ought to come back and do an impact review of the instructional practices in special ed classrooms across the board. We think that by that point, you'll be able to assess the fidelity of the process. You'll be able to look at how interventions are being utilized, how strategies are being utilized, what kind of resources, and then be able to decide by school where there needs to be targeted professional development, by certain maybe exceptionality areas where there needs to be targeted professional development, and making sure that those teachers have the knowledge and the skills to be able to move forward with instructional excellence, to move that bar across the board.
The next category that we have is data, and this is an important category for every school district. First and foremost, when we look at data in Sarasota County schools, absolutely data is being collected and analyzed and utilized in a variety of formats, but that is not necessarily consistent across the board. Certainly at the district level, we are making decisions based on data, but that is not always the case at school level or in the classroom level. One of the things that we're recommending in Recommendation 7.1 is to make sure that we provide teachers and paraprofessionals and related services staff with professional development and training on how to accurately collect data, how to analyze it, and how to utilize it in the classroom. That's not to suggest that's not happening now, but the inconsistencies that we see in data usage suggests that even the training that has occurred either hasn't been sufficient or hasn't been internalized to utilize in the classroom. And so as a result of that, our recommendation is that we look again at that and making sure that we are equipping our staff to make sure that they know how to collect, analyze, and utilize data. Recommendation 7.2 is focuses on your achievement gap in this district for ESE students, and that is something that's significant. Out of this report, we have a number of areas that are very significant and areas that we think are important to focus on. This section is one of the most important in my mind. When we look at the achievement gap in Sarasota special education, it does exist, and it is something that is problematic. When we look at data, we went back 5 years and looked at data. This both for ESE students, or excuse me, for ELA students, and for mathematics for our student data. This is the data that you have in the report and on the board is data that is coming directly from the state of Florida. And when we look at that, there are a few things to point out here. First and foremost, when we look at ELA and math, those two areas are very similar across the board. We have some variances, of course, but for the most part, ELA and math are in lockstep when you look at the student achievement data in this district. So it's not one versus the other here. It is a problem throughout. One thing that I think is important to point out as a commendation is when we look at our level 1 data, when we look at data, just to be clear, level 1 is our lowest level of data, right? When we look at that's the lowest level of achievement all the way up to level 5, okay, being the highest level. When we look at our level 1 student data, Sarasota is achieving better than the state average in that level 1, which is commendable. That is a great thing that this district is doing. We think that's really important. However, as we move to through those levels, it becomes a bit more problematic. The The challenge here is we know that our students, many of our special needs students are going to be in that level 1. It's not surprising to see higher percentages of students there than in level 5. That just naturally makes sense. We have students who are not achieving at those level 5 levels. That's where our high achieving general education students are at level 5. So we don't see nearly as many. So it's not problematic to me to look at that and say, oh, we have 1.6% of our students at level 5. That's not the concern. The concern is that we have 1.6% of our special ed students at level 5, and we have a gap of our regular ed students there. We have an achievement gap that occurs as we look down every single one of those levels that has existed in this district for at least the last 5 years. Year over year, we see no narrowing of that achievement gap. It is nearly consistent within a percent or so each year. What we'd expect to see there is that when we identify that there's a gap that was done a number of years ago, we expect to see processes and procedures put in place to narrow that gap. Even if it's just a small amount every year, we'd expect to see that. That's not the case here. We're seeing that, and if we went back prior to 5 years, we would see a gap that existed even prior to that. So we're putting interventions in place, we're working with our students, we're providing resources, but yet we still have that achievement gap. That's something that this district needs to address, and it needs to really focus on because it is simply unacceptable.
Want the next one?
Yes. We'll go to the next one. Recommendation 7.3 is regarding your TPS system. It's something I'm not sure how many of you all as board members have seen this. It is something that an outside provider has provided to you all as a district. It's an excellent system. It is very it provides a voluminous amount of data on behavior for students. We collect that student data, and it's student behavior data, and it's something that we utilize in that system. There's a lot of reporting that goes into that. What we see, though, is that teachers are staff members and teachers are collecting that data. They're inputting into a system. It is producing a report. That report's useful because it can go to the school principal, who can then look at the behavior. It's also something that this particular TPS system has a feature that it can send a report out to parents. All good things. A challenge becomes when we're utilizing the system. It is so detail-oriented. Without a background in behavior, it's oftentimes difficult to understand. And that is true not just for parents who might be receiving this, but it's true for teachers as well. The teachers are spending their time inputting data and spending a significant amount of time collecting that data in blocks throughout the day, putting it into the system so they're getting that out, but that data is not being utilized in the classroom to inform our behavior practices. The BCBAs may be using it, but our individual classroom teachers should know what to do with that too. If we're collecting data, we should be utilizing data. And so that's an important aspect of this as well. So we recommend sitting down with the company that provides you with the TPS system and maybe having them put together either some training for you or some summaries for you so that can be provided to parents so they have a strong understanding of what that behavior data means, and also for teachers to understand what that looks like as well. Recommendation 7.4 is specifically related to a special education data policy. It's something that should exist throughout the district. Sort of goes back to what we were talking about earlier with the notion of data collection, usage, and analysis, but it goes beyond that, how we store student data and how we utilize it to influence our decisions on the IEP as well. That should be a district-wide process and a policy in place coming from the ESC department.
Category 8, transitions. If you read this section in detail, you picked up on the fact that there are multiple ways that we transition our students, not just with exceptional student education, but throughout their educational career. Recommendation 8.1 talks specifically about the transfer process and revising the checklist, as I mentioned earlier, but most importantly, that we work closer with our school-based administrators when we have those students come in, and instead of having a holding location for them where they may not have their needs met, placing them in the appropriate setting from the get-go. And so that's something that has to be addressed. the delay in time has to be addressed. We have to make sure that we've got the appropriate information on that student, and that we have the school-based administrator and people at the IEP table that are making the right decisions in regard to where that student needs to be. Once we get that student in a certain location, it's very difficult to shift them, because then we can't do a reevaluation. We can do a change in placement, but we probably have data that is not adequate for the process. Recommendation 8.1B. We spent a little time with pre-K, and I had an opportunity to meet some wonderful little pre-K students, and so did Todd, and they're always attracted to his tie, so he becomes the center of attention. But as we talked to our educators and we talked about that transition process for our pre-K students, and we said, what happens when it's time for them to grow up and go to big school again? The one thing that came out every time was that the IEP process for pre-K students is not appropriate, that we're developing pre-K IEPs when they transition to kindergarten. We're not developing an IEP that's getting them ready for kindergarten. We need to be at the time of their transition, or even prior to, we need to be writing goals and objectives towards kindergarten. Their pre-K transition IEP needs to be about kindergarten, to have them prepared and ready to go, and to make sure that it's appropriate. The other thing is that we've got to provide equitable resources in pre-K. We went into many classes, and some were well-equipped, others were not. And I think Todd and I have looked at that across the board, and we know it's a budgetary issue. But if we're opening a pre-K unit, it should look just like this pre-K unit. And there needs to be the same identical resources available, following the same equitable curriculum, and making sure that those standards are set high. Recommendation 8.2A is to restructure the annual transition and articulation process. I have to tell you that there was not one person that we talked to that thought that the process that is currently in place was effective. They don't have time to talk about children, and it's starting too late. Transition should start in January or February. Those conversations should occur. It's not about the transition IEP, the transition plan. I think that process is heading in the right direction, but it's about those conversations. It's about having appropriate conversations, sharing the right information, and not doing it so quickly that we lose sight of what needs to happen to a student when they transition to your school. So those appropriate discussions need to occur so scheduling can be determined, and so we can actually make sure that the student has an effective transition IEP meeting and be able to work on those personal goals and objectives more effectively. 8.2B is to make sure that we structure and provide effective transition for special needs students. You have some very creative administrators that are doing some really quality transition opportunities for students. But we challenge you to go beyond that. We think that for students that have more difficulty transitioning, there needs to be multiple opportunities to go to their new site. They need to see what a real classroom looks like at their new school. They need to have an opportunity to see to have those supports in place, and to know that they may or may not have that same friend, their para, that's going to be transitioning with them. If we can enhance that process for transition and that preparation for our students that are most challenged, I would anticipate that the success rate would skyrocket and our behaviors would be reduced, because they're walking into a comfortable environment versus an environment that scares them to death with so many people. And if you start the transition process early in January, February, those kind of things would be an option. 8.3, increase the financial resources, and every time I say that, I know that the superintendent's going, but from where? And I understand that, so I'm just going to put this out there. In addition to the other things that you have going right for you here in Sarasota, which is multitude, You have some really good high school programs for secondary transition. You have opportunities for integrated employment, and you have independent living options, which are so important as our students graduate and need to be prepared in order to be independent adults. But those possibilities have to expand, and there needs to be more options across the board for students with special needs. In addition to that, there needs to be more availability for transportation. Many of your schools don't have enough transportation to be able to take students off-site to other locations. You have quality community partners, and we talk to the transition specialists who continue to seek those kinds of opportunities. So the foundation is there, and it looks like it has a lot of potential, but we would recommend that you look at expansion and making sure there's more opportunity to go off-site and be a part of the community. Todd?
Category 9 addresses training and professional development. And first of all, I think it's important to call out that in your ESC department currently, there is a lot of training and professional development that does occur, that is available for staff members throughout the school year. Not all of those are required trainings and professional developments, however, and part of that is based on a union contract and a lot of different pieces that go along with that. We understand that. But I think it's important to call out and commend the district and the ESC department for the level of professional development and training opportunities that they provide for staff, both in person and remotely online as well, including a summer session that occurs on an annual basis, which is, from what we've seen, excellent. And so I think first and foremost, we need to recognize that there is strong training and professional development occurring. That being said, when we look at some of the opportunities that are there, we see some gaps in some of that training. And some of these areas may already be offered in the district, but it's one of those things that if we're going to training and we're learning those pieces, but we're not taking them and implementing them in the classroom, that's really not, there's no benefit to either the professional or to the students receiving that. So when we look at some of the areas that we would recommend a focus on for some additional training and professional development, we would look at quality instructional practices because we don't see that consistent across the board. We see some amazing instructional practicing happening in some classrooms, but not in every classroom. And so we would like to see a little bit more of that. IEP development and compliance. We reviewed a number of IEPs in the district, and as you saw in the report, there are some inconsistencies in IEPs as well that need to be addressed. I think that a lot of that goes back to training and professional development. And we may not always have all the tools, as some of the professionals in the district may not have the knowledge or the tools that they need to construct an adequate IEP for our students. So professional development and compliance around that would be helpful. Paraprofessional training, we do offer. You all do offer paraprofessional training in the district currently, but that training should be expanded. That can also be expanded in the role as we look at some of the potential of paraprofessional coaches and some of the onboarding process that we discussed earlier, where that training could occur. Finally, the program specialists and ESE liaison training. Those are going to be very important should you decide to accept our recommendations and move those individuals into more of an academic-focused role. Many of them have spent a lot of time in compliance. We need to start readjusting that to an academic role as well, and they're going to need training and supports around that. Recommendation 9.2 expands upon that. One of the great things that the superintendent and his leadership team has put into place is a new role, the Professional Learning and Leadership Development Department, which I think will be a wonderful asset to this district. That department, in conjunction with the ESE department, should work to develop a professional development and training curricula, specifically designed for special education. Right now, what we have is we look at the professional development and training offerings in the ESE department. We see a lot of one-off trainings. things. All good, but we see a little bit of here, a little bit here, a little bit here. By developing a curricula that takes folks more through a pathway like we would see with our students, and building on what they're learning throughout the school year, we're going to have a more well-developed staff and more effective training for implementation in the classrooms, both the staff level and the student level. Recommendation 9.3 is, again, this is something that is, I would suggest, could be added to your wish list, but it is, of course, on the basis of available funding. You may want to consider designating, some paraprofessional coaches for your school buildings. Those are some areas to provide coaching and mentoring and modeling for paraprofessionals. It's something that is not currently in place in the district. But is something that, again, would be ideal, an ideal situation, but we also know there are funding constraints to that as well. One of the things that I did want to point out, we surveyed your staff as well, and we took a little snapshot of what they asked for as far as training and professional development goes. We asked them about areas of desired training, professional development. We gave them some options, but then also gave them an opportunity to submit their own ideas. And we wanted to report that back, just simply not to suggest that this is something you have to do, but just to give you an idea of where your staff is seeing some areas that they think that they could get some additional support. And not surprising, leading the pack is the behavior interventions. We see that in every district we go to. Teachers and staff members want to be equipped around behavior. Not all of them have a behavior background, and it's really important to provide that. So that's one area that we'd certainly encourage you to consider as you develop that curriculum for your training and professional development. Category 10 is parent and community relations. As was mentioned earlier, we conducted a number of parent outreach events. We did 2 in-person parent events, one on the north side of the county, one on the south side of the county. Together, they were marginally attended. We also conducted parent surveys. We did 2 parent surveys, one in the early summer, which was focused on and for parents to reflect on the end of the last school year, and then one in early October that focused on the beginning of this school year. Many of the questions were the same. We wanted to see what we were looking at as far as that goes, but we also changed some questions up to see how things are going, and you can visit that a little bit more in depth in the report and see some of those changes over time. A couple of things. One of the things that I think is really important in those that came out of those surveys and that you all should be very proud of is the notion that when we asked parents if they were partners in their students' education, the vast majority, 80+% of parents who responded to the survey said they were. And I think that's really important because that's not something that we often see when we ask that question in school districts. So something that this department and you all as a school board and a community should be very proud of is the fact that parents are feeling connected with this district and with the staff that you have here. So that's important. But one of the things that we noticed and in our conversations with parents and family members is really looking at a parent engagement plan for each school. When we host events, we know that parents, especially parents with special needs students, there's a lot on their plates. And you layer onto that potentially parents, single parent family and so forth. There's a lot going on. When their students come home at the end of the day, they need to be at home with that student typically. It's very difficult to go out and do events in the evening and so forth. We recognize that. But what we really want to do is develop that parent engagement plan for each school, to sort of have the school support our parents and really be a part of that, be a partner with them in that work, whether that's something that is happening in person at the school or whether that's something that's happening remotely via Zoom or what have you. Those types of things are really important to drive that parent engagement and really to create that relationship with parents. That's really what we want to drive here is a relationship with parents. So when we do have them come into that IEP meeting or sit in that tough conversation that we have to have about a student or about a program, we have that relationship developed and we can talk a little bit about some of those commonalities. Recommendation 10.2 is really specifically talking about IDEA and IEPs. This is not unique to Sarasota. It's true everywhere. We have parents who are very passionate about their students. They've been fighting for many years for the rights of their students and for the educational opportunities of their students and the health of their students in many cases. But many parents don't have the knowledge that they need on IDEA specifically and an IEP process. As a district, we believe that it's incumbent on the district to help them understand that process. And that can be done through a variety of resources, sort of the parent handbook of sorts, which does exist in some form and fashion, but really having those opportunities to provide that knowledge to parents of the why and the how of what we're doing, so that parents know we're not just arbitrarily making decisions. We have constraints within the law that as a school district we need to work within. And as professionals, we believe that this is in the best interest of your students, and here's why. So those are the kinds of conversations, rather than sitting down at an IEP meeting, throwing around a lot of terms that are very complicated and difficult to understand for anyone, a lot of acronyms, and then saying that's what's going to happen. That doesn't leave anybody feeling good about that situation. Recommendation 10.3. Is to really review the district communication policies for that regular and established communication method with families. We do family outreach and family communication on an as-needed basis currently. As we mentioned earlier, sort of on a regular communication pattern with staff members. The same thing should be happening with parents as well. Obviously, there should be individual communication processes in place for individual students, so we need to set up that that process and that method, sort of that cadence that we would have with our parents regarding their individual students, but also to the broader community for special needs parents, making sure that we are providing that outreach and that information on a regular and ongoing basis for them.
So let's talk about implementation and monitoring. Your special education program review will serves as a roadmap, and we've given you recommendations for estimated amounts of time that it should take you to process through this. Implementation is important, and how it's implemented, the superintendent referred to, it lays out a strategic plan for this special ed department. It lays out an opportunity for growth. And your special education department has so much potential beyond where they are right now. Sarasota has always been known for their quality of programs, and this shall continue. And now that you have a roadmap for monitoring and for implementation, this will be that much stronger. And when we finish a report like this and we look at the potential within a district, we recommend any district that we are in to engage with an external partner to assist with implementation and monitoring over a 2-year window. And we would recommend that to you also as a board. Whether you choose us or whether you choose an outside entity, we recommend that be a given. That's the only way that you're going to have effective implementation. It's the only way you're going to be able to monitor progress, and an outside entity can offer you that. So we just wanted to encourage you to think about that, and obviously, take the opportunity to take this document and make it a living document that will lead you to continue your success here in the district. And with that, we're open for questions.
Well, first of all, thank you very, very much for the work you guys did. I know I really appreciate the way in which, particularly, you highlighted the amazing people that are inside this district and really went down to the processes, which is where we have so much opportunity. So I'm really looking forward to it. So I'll start with Karen. Mrs. Rose.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I wasn't expecting that, but I'll take it.
Yeah, no worries. Sorry about that. Unless you want to wait,
No,
but I was
I'm
going to
good.
go around.
I appreciate the opportunity. I'm ecstatic over this report. I think that it's a long time in coming, and no surprises for me, having spent my career as a teacher for exceptional student education. I welcome this, and I think it has incredible recommendations that will give our students the academic growth that we're accountable for, and support our teachers and staff. The things that I do want to point out are and these aren't, I don't have any questions because you did such a thorough job, but I do want to reinforce a few pieces, if I may.
Absolutely.
The achievement gap, I think, is paramount. I think that we, as a district, pride ourselves in at least being above the state average. And when we look at our exceptional student education students, we are not. And that isn't because of staff. And I'm glad that you've pointed that out. We have incredible teachers, principals, district staff, and huge opportunity here with these recommendations. And I think that in and of itself will have an impact on the climate and the culture. I think data is at the heart of it. One of the pieces, too, that you pointed out that I think is front and center is that as we go forward, I'm interested in going forward with these recommendations as one individual board member, that we're including teachers and school-based staff and principals in the frameworks and in the engagement of this and the belief in where we're going and supporting academic growth with our students. So that I'm extraordinarily thankful and confident with the leadership that we have in superintendent and district staff to really start going places in ESE. It's long overdue, and the data piece is long overdue. Thank you.
Thank you. Mrs. Marinelli.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Well, I'd also like to thank both of you. I think I've never really seen such a thorough report in all the years I've been in education. And I also really want to thank my fellow board members who, I want the community and parents and everybody to know this was a 5-0 vote that we wanted you to dig into this. And I think it makes sense for me from hearing from teachers and that what some of their frustrations were, especially pointing out the behavior. And I do think we have excellent staff from district, classroom, paraprofessionals. They need help and they've been crying. So this is a framework to where things can start. And I do have a lot of faith in our superintendent, and I look forward to our one-on-ones, because I think it's very critical as we move forward that there's a history. And we have people in this district, whether they're still working, retired, or on the board, that have a history. And where we've been, where we are, kind of what happened. Also, it shows that systems and procedures fell apart. And when those things fall apart, then we see some of the results that are in this framework. So I do appreciate it, and I think our parents and our staff will appreciate it. This was some of this was hard to hear. You try not to take some of it personal. I mean, I used to work in part of this, and you point out things, and it's difficult, but it had to come out, and we can only move forward and do great things for our students, because that's why we're here, and our staff. So thank you. I look forward to working with our superintendent and over a couple of years.
Thank you. Mr. Edwards.
Wow. I started by saying when I greeted Todd and Bambi this morning that I had to read the report 3 times because the information was so intense and very rich. And being a non-educator, I empathize even more with parents who sit in an IEP meeting and have these terms and these acronyms and these compliance checklists, and so how overwhelming that is for our parents and our students. So I do have a couple of questions. I know that when we met, we talked a little bit about financial creep that had happened between a school-based job and was it a grant-funded position, and then and those kinds of things. Is that part of what ended up in the movement of money from the general fund? I'd like to try and identify that, because I'm more on the business side of things, and to try and figure out how we can look at those numbers coming from the general fund.
Well, and it's an excellent question. So first of all, I want to say that we did not do a full financial audit. We looked at the budget and we looked at the numbers to make some determinations and some recommendations. So please understand, this is not a full financial audit. But when we look at that and we look at the changes in staffing over time, it appears to us that many of those dollars that are coming out of the general education fund are in fact going for staff and going for increased staffing. That's important, right? We're not suggesting that we don't need some of those staff members, but what we want to do is we want to look at where we're utilizing that, and do we need all of those resources in place? Let me give you an example of that. When we take a look at Oak Park, for example, we look at Oak Park School. We have a number of vacancies currently among paraprofessionals in that building. And at the time when we were there, I think it was around 30. I think it's gone down since then. I think there's some of those positions have been filled, but around 30-ish or so. And when you look at that, though, as we start looking at those student populations in that building, I'm just using Oak Park as one example. We look at that, we want to look and say, okay, who are the students that are in this building, and do they need to be in this building? Because as we went through that building for a couple days and talked to people and so forth, there were clearly students who could be moved back into their traditional building and traditional classroom setting. And when we start looking at that and doing that evaluation of, are we properly identifying EBD students and ASD students, and we have a overabundance of OHI students and so forth, if we correctly categorize students and correctly identify students and move them back into their traditional school buildings when it's appropriate and necessary, we'll see that we don't need all of those staff members and those vacant positions that are there. I'm not suggesting we should get rid of staff members, but we can certainly trim back some of those vacancies that are there and just not fill them to save a lot of resources. And that can be said at other buildings as well. When we start looking at buildings, we want to be efficient in what we're doing. And making sure that when we go through that MTSS process, right, we are providing all of those interventions on the front end in Tier 2 and Tier 3, so that maybe some of our students who are being recommended for special education may not need to be there. And then we start looking at some of those opportunities where we say, do we need all of these programs? Do we need all of the cluster sites? Do we need all of the staff for special education specifically? Or can we provide interventions in a general education setting for these students so that we don't see that big increase in spending and pulling from the general fund? Does that answer your question?
It does, and it kind of, and my understanding, working with the previous administration, particularly when you described the Esser Cliff, was that those were chips on the table to find out if we really need that staff.
Right.
What my challenge has been all along, just again, as a non-educator watching this process and realizing that there were problems that you've uncovered for us, is that it often is boots on the ground and there aren't enough hands to do what's necessary. And so those ESSER chips, if you will, were put out there to be reevaluated. To your point, do we really need them, or can they be redesigned or and made more efficient, and bring those dollars back in-house once they're redesigned? So that was my understanding of why you saw that cliff. So, but I'm focused in on just wanting to try to get a handle, and I appreciate you can't answer it, but making sure that it's not sustainable to keep taking those dollars from the general fund, and we have to clearly look at that bottom line. One of the things that I want to throw out there too, and I don't know if I'm thinking on the right lines, but when I really examined our pre-K piece of this, and I take it deep, not just in the ESE world, but across the board. And then you fast forward that to the third grade data. What I've missed, particularly in Title I schools, is that we don't really have an assessment on kids that move into our district, wherever they fall in the spectrum. We don't take an assessment. And to me, that is what you were describing about MTSS, that we should have that across the board. All students that we inherit should come in through that process so that we know which reading interventions or which language interventions or programs, to your point, knowing that Gillingham is a program, it's an intervention, it's not the curriculum. But so I'm just wondering if there is an economy of scale as we start to look at this, where the data policy, all those things are bigger than just what you guys are pointing out in your process, and that the examination of the MTSS really should go across the board in our ELA and our English language learners and all across, so that we're getting an assessment regardless of exceptionality, so that we know where the student is in general ed or exceptional. So I appreciate that, because so much of what I saw here that you pointed out, I'm like, well, that happens across the board, or that happens. So I appreciate that. I think that's what I have in terms of questions. One other thing that I guess when I looked at when you get to the high school part and you talk about plans for our students, that's a big deal for me when I talk about all students should leave us with a plan. They're enrolled, enlisted, or employed, and that includes our ESE students. But I've seen, and I talked to a lot of our community members who are engaged in those programs for our ESE students, and what I find also is that those businesses or those organizations that partner to work with our ESE students also are challenged. They have tremendous needs and require support. I'm asking that, is there best practices for that? Are there places to go where we can help our community members who are trying to develop those programs and enhance those programs? Because there's a huge opportunity here. I mean, I know we have, you said, a great team who works on that, but there's a huge need that we haven't even scratched that surface.
Right. Absolutely.
But are there best practices? Are there places that someone like me can go to and find out how to engage the community, and then provide supports from the school district with those partners?
I would think, you have community and business partners in various sections of the district. And I think that tapping them and making presentations periodically about the quality programs that we have for students and how they could also benefit bringing those students into their business would be a really good start.
Yeah, I was thinking if those programs have models done outside of the district or outside of already in the state or somewhere else. You and I we can talk about that offline.
Well, and one of your resources for some of those programs would be the Transition Education Network that the state of Florida has. I mean, if you go to their website, there is a plethora of examples there. And I would anticipate that the superintendent has connections with individuals in other districts where they have very high-level career college programs, some of which you have gone far beyond, and others that would be a good example as you continue to expand the programs that are available.
I think that Florida network is really critical
I
for you to
think
take a look at if that's something that you're interested in pursuing. But the other piece that I'd point out as well is when we were in your buildings and we were meeting with your transition staff members, you have a lot of a wealth of knowledge and people who are committed and very, very caring for these students here in your district. You have tremendous resources here. we'd love to see it expanded. We'd love to see more students served. And to your point, you're absolutely right. There's much more to be done. But there are some great people here just locally on site in your buildings who are doing great work around that. Coupling that together with the resources available through the state of Florida, I think will be a great opportunity for you.
Great. Thank you so much for your work. It was a long time coming, and I learned a whole lot myself. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
So I want to say again, thank you. There was so much, try to get like emotional. There's so much in here that I think, when you look historically, and I want to say this very clearly, there have been challenges in this district, but I believe this is a great opportunity to take those things, look them straight in the eye, and look at these as opportunities. It's not about finger pointing or anything of that nature. But what I think is interesting of lessons learned, I'll use the EBD as an example, and something we, and myself included, have to really reflect on is not reacting so much that we end up creating bad practices and policies where you hurt the outcome. And I think that with all of the various balls up in the air that every member of staff, administrators, and even families all have to deal with, when we deal with something like that, sometimes the pendulum swings so much farther. And I think that really shined a light into, and I think there's a couple other examples throughout our history as a district that I think that some of those issues kind of have shined a light on. And I appreciate looking at this as, and I think that you guys reiterate this a number of times, which is why I'm so grateful, is really focusing on building on best practices in a proactive way to allow, because we do have tremendous people in our school district that I think will read this and be cheering, because there were just some broken processes, particularly a disconnect from the central office to the schools, but also ensuring that we're building and preparing them to set the stage for the most fruitful situation possible, so that and I think that I talk about the recording of IEPs a lot, and I recognize that, and that sometimes goes in the wrong direction of thinking it's a gotcha. No, it's more like every scenario we want to set the stage. We want to have parents prepared, because when you walk in that room, you have no idea, and it is emotional. And so we've talked about using websites or FAQs and using whatever jargon, because a lot of times when it's a parent who hasn't dealt with this before, they're on top of that. They're dealing and navigating something they've never done before. It's very intimidating. It's very emotional. And having a mechanism that is not intimidating in any way. Sometimes that means not even talking to somebody. It's just doing your initial research on your own can do a tremendous amount for setting the stage. But you guys lay those kind of foundations in a number of areas, and I really appreciate that. The one question I have, there are a handful of areas that I'm very excited, and I will say that, Mr. Edwards, you mentioned that, and I agree that there are some areas that they highlight in here, but it's like, wait, this is actually happening. This would be impactful, or as an area of opportunity, and that would impact the entire district. HR being one of those areas. I think that, I know that we've talked about that as a board frequently, and I really appreciate going really granular about how important it is, because just from a financial aspect, when we hire and onboard someone, we want to retain them and put them in the right placement. We're not even, and then we're talking about the impact they have on, a child's life and the transfer. I mean, I could go on and on. I very, very much appreciate this. The one question I do have is when it comes to the reorg, there was a recommendation under our chief academic officer, then the chief pupil, it's page 12. Chief of Pupil Support Services, and then the Director of ESE and Student Services. So we've done some restructure. The prior superintendent, and then I know that our new superintendent really hasn't done too much outside of that. I am actually very excited we have a Chief Academic Officer. A lot of what you highlighted is what I think I've heard my fellow colleagues who've been in this arena for a really long time, is the emphasis really on the academics and how we support these areas. So I'm very, very happy about that. But one question was to really get to the point where we're able to have more consistent, streamlined experiences and services, and including PD. If we're adding an additional layer, because I'm going based on what I've heard from members of staff, is that disconnect with central office. And this is over the years. This is, again, not finger pointing anywhere. Is there any kind of thought to regionally, having things set up so that there is more people on the ground than actually adding another layer in central office? Or is that Are you following what I'm saying?
I am.
Okay.
I understand. I think I understand where you're saying the notion of having folks out in the buildings as much as having another layer in the org chart of the central office. The reason we did this, and I'll be honest with you, the two of us have had significant conversations about this very issue. We believe that it is important to have someone at a chief role in this position, and the reason for that is I mentioned earlier, is that in order to get a high quality candidate to come into that role, you need someone in that level. You also need someone who's going to be able to be a part of those high level discussions with the superintendent, and the superintendent may or may not choose to have that person as a part of cabinet, but having that person who is able to make some of those tough decisions and big decisions at a high level, that's really important as well. So we're pretty strong in our opinions of the Chief of People Support Services position. That executive director position, we sort of went back and forth on that a little bit, to be honest with you. But when you're consolidating two large departments, ESE and Student Services together, to have someone at that chief level who's then also managing directors is a very difficult lift for one individual to do. A couple of areas there. One, you risk setting a person up for failure by doing that and putting too much on their plate. But you're also going to have a challenge finding someone who can do all of those things and wear all of those hats. So putting that medium level, if you will, position in there as really someone who is overseeing those three director level positions, we believe is something that is going to be of benefit to the district. Now, to your point of having more boots on the ground in the buildings, we have that in many cases already with our ESE liaisons. We're just, in our opinion, not always utilizing them effectively.
Okay.
We also have that in our program specialists. Program specialists aren't in every building, but they're assigned to a handful of buildings.
Right, and that's
having those individuals then be more out and be more actively engaged in those buildings rather than sitting in central office, in their offices, dealing with compliance and so forth. Let's get them out in the buildings. Those are your boots. You don't have to hire anybody new to do that. You have a team already. If we can take those and kind of shift those responsibilities and shift that thinking to a more academic setting, I think that's going to be your boots on the ground for one thing, but also it's going to be that greater impact on academics and student achievement.
I'm very glad you said that, because that was some of the notes I took from the liaisons, but I'm also glad you mentioned the compliance piece, because again, I think a lot of some of this is reaction to what's happened in the past, and I understand that, but I think we've heard my colleagues say this before, but compliance is it's an expectation. Like, we have to do that, right? So that's not, and yes, it's good to have someone over to help with the paperwork and dotting I's, crossing T's 100%, but elevating the academic focus was just a breath of fresh air to read that from your takeaway. And I know some of my colleagues, I think all of us would agree with that. Did you have something to say? I just saw you leaning over. Okay.
I'm just reinforcing what you're saying.
So-
We definitely believe that the compliance has to be the foundation, no doubt about it. But we have to go beyond that. It's about moving academic achievement, and if we can move academic achievement from a state level, then we should be able to do it from a district level.
Absolutely. Well, and then one other piece that I think was really important, and I would be remiss if I didn't highlight it, but really appreciate your statement about the unique and challenge that Oak Park is. I mean, it is a truly unique, and we're very fortunate to have this option here, but it is not. It's geared for a very specific kind of student, although that ranges. And I think that many of the amazing people who work there have been, that I don't know that they feel that people recognize that. So I think it's really amazing that you did, because I know you guys saw it right off the bat, and I wanted to reiterate that. I know my colleagues here have mentioned it many times as well, so I just really appreciate you highlighting that. My final statement would be, and the last piece, really, the real last piece is, and it's not so much a question, but I'm glad you highlighted it, because it's like, this is amazing, and now it's on us to execute. Well, really, you. And then, but you mentioned something, and there's so many times when we have a consultant come in and do work, the financial piece, really glad you highlighted that. I think that's something we do need to look into. We have, whether that's for our audit committee or after the superintendent kind of provides us additional information. But using a third party to help us implement so that we really hold ourselves accountable. And I've recognized that we don't have a money tree, but when it comes to the investment, there are so many ways in which I think there's a proactive approaches that will pay dividends in the end, not only just financially, but also in our student achievement, which is what we're here for. So I would reinforce the need to have that as we move forward. Mrs. Marinelli.
Thank you. And that was one thing I wanted to address too, because we did talk about it as having that follow-up. And, I know we can't make those decisions. We have to, our superintendent, but I don't want to see this just get put on a shelf, which happens so many times when we have these kind of, we've never had one like this, but in other areas. And so I really look forward to having those conversations to have you come back and come back and come back. But I also want people to realize too, and for us as a board to think about it, because you brought it up. And I don't think most people realize how close student services and the ESE work together. And I think we need to have a look at how the whole student services is going to, how it's aligned. And how is it going to align with this? Sure. Because MTSS is a huge process. Right. And it happens at the school level. And you already talked, you hit about the resources. So many things fall on the school counselor. So that all has to be looked at of when you have compliance, because we haven't even talked about 504, which is a huge compliance. Mm-hmm. And this district has many, many people, students on 504. So I almost think we need to do something like this for student services, because we are going to capture a whole bunch of students that need help. And it needs to happen in the curriculum and the intervention piece. So that's just something I want people to think
I
about.
highlighted the MTSS because I was like, yes, I agree.
I don't think people realize how much goes on in student services to even get to the ESE process, because it is people, compliance, finances, workload, part of that whole transition process when students leave high school. Are they going to be ready? So I don't think we can just look at one part and not look at the other down the road. So thank you.
I'm just reading your body language.
And you're doing it well. Thank you, Madam Chair. I just want to emphasize, Mr. Edwards, what you were saying with the similar analogies, correlation to general education, the things that have been pointed out in exceptional student education. I think that what we're talking about are systems and how those systems function, who's providing oversight at the top, and the importance of the staff in our schools, in the classrooms, and their input and engagement of that, all the frameworks and consistency. And even if you're just looking at behaviors, which quite honestly are surfacing with input from teachers and from community often. And you're looking at that balance between the MTSS process, those interventions, those tiers of support provided in classrooms, combined with consequences. Those are all part of the systems. I think that what we're looking at is a realignment of systems, which Superintendent Connor has started and has brought in data where we as a board can provide that oversight. It can guide the district staff all the way down to guiding teachers in classrooms and provide families with input, but not leaving out of this process the input of the actual stakeholders, the students, the parents, and the staff in our schools. So I think that we're on an incredible trajectory that is data-based and community input, stakeholder-based. So I couldn't be more excited. I want to also emphasize Mrs. Ziegler with adding district staff. I'm not a proponent of adding administrators. I spent my life as a teacher, and let's add the teachers. I think that, from my individual perspective, we've got to add administrative, high-level oversight. Our district has grown tremendously. We obviously have a systems challenge, a framework challenge, a consistency, all of which you have pointed out. And we can better adapt the resources that we have. I'm extraordinarily excited, and I don't look at any of this, and it's my final statement, as a negative. I look at it as what we as a district have taught our students as productive failure. Everything that we can do better is going to grow success. So I thank you for this report from the bottom of my heart. I thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Edwards.
Yes, thanks. I'm glad that we're all seeing the synergies across the board here, and that's why I brought it up. One of the things that might be helpful for all of us is to take the prioritization and recommendation pages and add the costs associated, which I think, if you had to fill that org chart and all those positions, and just so that we had, and we know it's an approximation, because I know that there's challenges about adding to administrators. We always have that conversation. And when I think about, we just went through a program, for example, where I think we as board members were given 4 or 5 options around what we could do with behaviors. And I think how much time and effort the administrators and people that should have been boots on the ground in the classrooms doing systems and procedures and all the things that we moved them over to look at all what those options are. And now, what are those costs? Where are those hours? And how do we economize that? I think one of the obvious things that you pointed out is that we have ESE liaisons in every school, 1 per every school, and they're all doing compliance. If we unbundle the compliance piece and have compliance liaisons, then do we really need ESE liaisons at every school if there's compliance people? There's ways to leverage everyone to their highest values if we're getting those hours back and we're dedicating to the systems and procedures and data that you point out. Because I ask Mr. Connor every time, I'm sure 3 or 4 times in our one-on-one, well, if you're going to do that, what's the benchmark where we're starting and where are you hoping to end up? And I get the same answer. I'm working on that right now.
Well, and I like that piece of it. I think there's always the financial impact, and even when we're talking about new positions, and this is really where our superintendent falls into place, and we talk about that no different than when we did the reorg, at least for myself, but I know you already included this in the evaluation piece, but is evaluating, so anytime we add, we can very clearly, because this is something that systems-wise this district has lacked, an ability to go back and evaluate where did that person, their responsibility was this, and they moved the needle here and here. And obviously it's always a team sport, that's not one person, but we've got to have some way to measure that. And I think that's been lacking, but I think that you put that forward. And I think even though we add, so in addition to the financial impact of some of these, yes, positions, a lot of these are staffing, but we are in a people business. Much of it is going to require staffing, but some of it is going to be shifting around, I'm assuming. Is that correct? Mm-hmm. Mr. Connor, did you have any comments?
No, I just want to say thank you for taking the time and spending so many months with us, and really want to just make sure we understand that sometimes this is a vulnerable thing to do, right? When you have a review or so a third party comes in, and I just want to thank our staff who really took on the challenge and opened up. And we're very transparent, and we're vulnerable, because when you highlight certain things, you can take that very personally, right? We dedicate our lives, our educators dedicate their lives to this work, and I'm just thankful that we have such a high quality staff here. This is not a people problem. This is a process and systems issue that I think is going to has been a beautiful roadmap, and it starts with transparency, right? So we have to start and we have to show where the warts are and where we need to work. And so The road to accountability is through transparency, and this is a perfect start. And so now you've given me a gift as a new superintendent because I come in alongside of my transition plan and I'm evaluating every aspect of this organization. And you really got deep with this, and this has been very helpful for me. And I will tell you to just to reaffirm what's been said with our board members, this will live within the strategic plan.
Yep.
So it will not go away. You will see verbatim many of the recommendations built in to our refreshed strategic plan. I'm coming up on the end of the 100 days, so I'm on day 91.
But who's counting?
I've been counting every one of them, every chance I get. But I will tell you, I'll have a summation of the 100 days that I'll release to the public after the 100 days. And within that, that will lead us to the strategic plan and what those strategies and initiatives will be. But I can't thank our staff in this district enough for just being vulnerable, being open, and taking on this challenge. They're ready for this. They're ready for the next step. And it's going to take every one of them to do that. So thanks to all the staff at the district level, at our school sites, and everyone here in this boardroom. Thank you.
Thank you. No, I'm glad. I will reiterate that. I appreciate you saying that, and I think we don't know where we need to go unless we have a look in the mirror. And so you guys did a tremendous job. I am.
Thank you.
I would say speechless, but I'm speaking a lot, so that's not true. But I'm very, very, I'm really, really grateful. I'm grateful to the board for making this a priority collectively. I think there's great work ahead of us. So I look forward to the next steps. So what are the next steps? So you're going to provide that through the strategic plan, and then we have specific deliverable times, because I don't want this to go, because we meet, and then we meet again, and then it's like, wait, what, we were talking about this?
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. So actually some of this has already started. So under the leadership of Ms. O'Day and Mr. Renoff and the team have already broke this down and looked at the 6-month recommendations. Some of them we've already started on, and they're low-hanging fruit ones. But we've got a strategic plan, and I want to thank you guys for allowing us an opportunity to look at the timeline to really delineate, can we do that within a year? Can we do that within 6 months? And so our team was able to evaluate that, provide some feedback, and they incorporated that in there. So I appreciate that. And so we're working on that, and as a part of the strategic plan updates that will happen quarterly as we get that finalized, this will come back into view during those discussions. Some of these may live in the human capital part of a strategic plan, like the job descriptions or the HR processes. Some of them will live in the academic excellence side of things. Obviously, achievement gap, huge area of focus, and I thank Todd for making that an emphasis, because when you look at our federal index, and that's where the feds look at subcategories of all of our populations, we struggle systemically with our ESE population across a lot of our schools. And that's usually the one area. If there is one area at a school that's been struggling with persistently, it's been in the area of ESE. So that will live in that part of the strategic plan. So you're going to see this continuously throughout our quarterly updates.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Are we going to see that financial impact of their recommendations?
I'll take that recommendation and have our team look at it and see if we can provide at least an estimate of where we're at. So I will say we've had a lot of internal conversation, and if we were able to do everything tomorrow, it would be a cost.
Yeah.
There would be additional cost involved in that. But to your point, going back and reevaluating the impact of existing positions and what could be, do we need as many ESE liaisons? How many can we peel back and then convert to compliance liaisons? Could be, cost neutral. So those are the things that we're evaluating continuously to really offset as much cost as possible. Thank you.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions, comments? With that, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thank you
very
all
much.
very much.
We look forward to seeing you guys again soon, but then thank you again. All right.
So, Madam Chair, we are well ahead of schedule. So we did set aside 3 hours for this particular one. We are at 2 hours. So we could take a short break and then pick up with the next item on the agenda and then do lunch, or I'll let you want to do that?
Break. So I was going to do a 5-minute break, but did you guys want to wait until to resume after 1 o'clock, or you want to go through?
A small break and then do the next item?
That would be my preference,
yeah.
like a 15-minute break, and then we'll come back and we'll get, if Mr. Parento is okay with that.
Yep. we're good.
Okay.
Thank you.
So we resume. Oh, the clock's back, but I can see it. 15 minutes, whatever 15 minutes is from now. 12:15.
The clock's back.
Okay, we are back. It is November 28th, and we are resuming our workshop, and we are starting back with policy updates. And Mr. Connor, if you'd like to introduce our wonderful guests.
All right. Well, thank you, Madam Chair. We're at that point where this has become a regular part of our work sessions for the last several months, where we are undertaking several of our policies, reviewing them, revising them, so that they are in compliance with legislation. And so, no exception, we're going to go through several of those today. We have Mr. Chris Parento and our legal counsel, Patrick Duggan, here to review some policies. Just a couple of stats, and I want to just thank Mr. Parento for the hard work he's done just in the very short time that he's been there. Since late August, 215 of those policies, of our 430 policies, have already been reviewed. So we're halfway there. And 49 have been brought forth for revisions at various levels. 24 of them have been advertised for final adoption or removal, and 27 of them have been flagged for further review or needing revision. And we're working with our internal teams to make sure that those revisions are made. So we're excited about the progress that we're making in terms of policy. And so we will present today several policies. You've had a chance to review them over the last couple of weeks. And without further ado, I'll hand it over to Mr. Parento.
Thank you, Superintendent Connor. Members of the board, I appreciate the opportunity to be here and present these policies to you today. And I'll echo what the superintendent just said. None of this could be done without the assistance of staff. And we do have a lot of the members of the teams that have been a part of this revision and review process here with us today to answer any questions that you may have. And we'll start going through these one by one as we've done in the past, and if there are any questions, we'll pause after each different policy so that any questions that you have, we can get those answered. And if you have any feedback or requests, we can make sure that we're taking care of those. The first policy that we're bringing to you today is policy 3.40, campus disorders and trespassing. The revision to this policy changes the title of the policy so that we're able to create a more thorough trespassing policy, which we'll discuss next. This also adds details to the current policy on issuing a trespass warning in accordance with that new policy, which would be 3.401. On 3.401, which would be the new trespassing policy, this is new to the district. It would define the terms, the procedures for issuing a trespass warning, who's authorized to give such a warning, and the time period that a trespass warning would be active. It also outlines the documentation that would be needed leading to a trespass warning being issued and defines the appeal process for someone who is issued a trespass warning.
And if I may on this, this is something to create a tool for use. It's not something to be used or intended to be used for convenience of someone's annoying someone at the school or someone is not, appreciated in the boardroom meeting. Because really what we're talking about here is you've done something wrong this time that we can't address it. The tools that we have right now are not enough to address it now. That future action is necessary to prevent you from doing it again in the future, which I think is a very, very, very small amount of the time, both at the school, in the boardroom. I think what will be important with this policy will to be use great restraint, to not be issuing too many trespass warnings. This is mostly designed to give a tool for the rainy day when this is needed. I know recently there was an incident at one of our high schools where we didn't have the tools to do what we needed to do, and had this been in effect, we would have been able to address something more effectively. But I think it will be incumbent upon everybody to really look at this with restraint and use this as sparingly as possible, but with recognition that you need to have those tools for when you need them.
If we have any questions, do we wait till the end or after?
No, based on the actual
Okay.
policy, let's hit it while you're there. And then it's more of a free form. Sorry, I was looking down, so please.
I just want to make sure on this trespassing, so that would include the landings, that would include the schools, sporting events, or anything that if an incident happened and on the rare occasion that this is all encompassing for the whole district and any activity that is district supported.
I think it would involve some flexibility that would depend on the circumstances. For example, someone's a problem at the school, but not a problem at the board meeting, for example. I think that you want to narrowly kind of define where they would be permitted to return to and not
I don't
return.
mean that. I understand. I mean, it just, in general, if you're going to issue a trespassing, it includes the whole district. Like, if
Well, you
somebody's
have-
very disruptive here at the landings, you might have to call for our law enforcement, and they might deem that we need to issue a trespassing. That's what I'm getting at. Or if it's at a sporting event.
Yes, it would apply to schools, school buses, the landings, any
school board
school property. And that's defined actually in that policy when you look at it.
Yep. Anywhere we have the authority to have issue, trespass, so you see it.
And just to add, it's designed where a district level administrator is empowered and is the person who is the issuer of it, with our law enforcement team to be the deliverer of it. So we segment that out. I will also add, I wrote a very similar policy for Sarasota County. This is very similar to the public property trespassing policy that Sarasota County government has. It's tweaked a little bit for the purposes of school, but when I was in-house counsel for the sheriff several years ago, I worked with the county attorney's office to write something similar for them to give them the tools they needed at that time.
Okay. Moving on to 4.20. Is that right?
Not yet.
I'm not going to read this. I'll follow yours.
Next policy is 5.80. This is our athletics policy. We updated this one in line with some new state legislative language that would allow public school students to participate in extracurricular activities at a different public school or a private school if their public school does not offer the activity. It also allows a student who transfers during the school year to continue participating in interscholastic extracurricular activities at their previous school for the remainder of that school year, as long as their parents provide the transportation or their guardians provide their transportation to those extracurricular activities. And we have also now included our district's good cause allowance within the policy. That had previously been in our procedures, but we're putting it in the policy to allow that extra layer of transparency with this one.
Okay. And this is from new legislation, which is a little different. And I know we've had some questions. I'm looking over there, but I'm not going to discuss. They've had some questions recently come up from families. But I know our staff's very well and familiarized with the new policies. Yes? I'm looking at nodding. Okay. Are there any questions on this one? Comments? Okay. We can move forward.
The next policy is 4.40, extracurricular program. These changes are all the same as with the athletics policy, just making sure that because extracurricular activities are included in addition to just athletics, that those are covered within our policy, and we're up to date with that one as well.
Okay.
Next policy, 5.62, administration of medication during school hours, and the next few policies are all going to be similar to this one. This was a legislative change last year that a student is allowed to possess or use medication regulated by the U.S. Food and Drug Administration for over-the-counter use to treat and/or relieve headaches while on school property or at school-sponsored events or activities without a physician's note or prescription. So we just wanted to update our policy to be in line with that new state guidance. Policy 5.61, student illness, adds a reference in, I believe it's the third item, to policy 5.62 with those changes that they can take over-the-counter medication without a prescriptions note. Policy 4.431 is field trip medication training for teachers and staff, and it adds item 4 about the new state guidance that, again, they can take the over-the-counter medications without needing a physician's note for that. Policy 4.43 is for field trips. It updates the parental notification requirements and overnight lodging requirements in accordance with Florida Department of Education rule. And it adds a similar addition to the policy that we added to 3.31 previously, the school-sponsored events and activities that we reviewed during the October workshop. Policy 5.56, student health services. We added a revision in this to cover all minor students. Previously, the policy only covered students in grades K-3, but we updated it to all minor students and added guardian notification as well as parental notification to that policy.
Thank you.
The next few policies all involve school choice. The first is 5.20, student assignment. This policy was very similar but less thorough to policy 5.201. So we made some changes to it to have this policy cover student attendance zones and choice options. And within it, you'll see that we did take a lot out, especially as it relates to controlled open enrollment, so that that can live within the controlled open enrollment policy. And if we ever make changes in the future to that, we're not having to update multiple policies and potentially having some discrepancies in the middle. 5.201 is student out-of-zone transfers and choice. This provides a lot of updates to give some clarity on what each school choice option is and additional information about each, as well as our reassignment process. 5.23 is the controlled open enrollment policy. We revise some of the eligibility and placement requirements, referencing the relevant statutes and just making sure that we had this up to date with new state guidance. 4.65 is virtual instruction. We removed outdated items and options within the policy so that it is current and accurate with the offerings that we have. 4.70 is the same. That is the home education program. We cleaned up the policy and removed a couple of items to be more in line with state statute. Policy 5.305. This was originally the threat assessment teams policy. The first recommendation is to rename this threat management teams because that is the new state standard. We spent a lot of time on this policy just making sure that we have everything covered and that this is a very thorough and comprehensive policy. We updated the roles and responsibilities of the school-based threat management teams, district threat management teams, and meeting requirements. Updated our definitions based on the new Florida model, outlined the criteria for determining unfounded or factual claims and levels of concern, and aligning our timelines for parental contact, as well as the addition of information on continual monitoring of a student during the student support management plan.
I know Mr. Enos can't be with us today, and I know we go through the process publicly here, and then in the event there are any edits, but I just want to make sure, Mr. Superintendent, you just check with him on particular, any of them, but he will lend a very valuable eye on these particular policies. Mr. Edwards.
Thank you. I know I've spoken to the superintendent about this before, but with this threat management teams process, and I know it's a pretty extensive process, and I've read it, and I've been to a couple seminars regarding it, I was hoping that we could actually have a communications plan to the community that matches this threat assessment, so that when information is disseminated, and it starts when it happens and it has a completion. And I'd love to see a communications plan that matches this document.
Item H on page 2, and again, I know we went into this before, the reasonable effort. The word reasonable, we actually had a finite time frame in a former policy. Again, is there a reason we didn't get to that? So we're still on 5.305. Under definitions, I suppose it is item 2H, page 2H. Reasonable effort to notify the exercise of reasonable diligence and care to make contact with the student's parent or guardian. Does it have a specific time?
I can tell you.
Remember, we talked about this in another policy, and that was actually Tim Mr. Enos in that moment being like, no, you know what, we talked about, and again, it was literally, if they were talking about school, it was before they leave the school. So, I think we all had a very strong feeling about that. So I just want to make sure they match. Now, I don't know if this is broader in that amending that time frame is not applicable? I have to, but I think it would be.
I can tell you we used the definitions that were in the state rule and the state training materials, word for word. So
Can we make them more specific?
Sure, yeah, you can. Okay, yes, absolutely.
Mrs. Rose?
I wholeheartedly agree. That was an in-depth discussion that we had of parents and having notice before a student goes home and tells the parent. That was the whole emphasis of it at the time, and I believe we all agreed on that. Before, no, it wasn't the same day in my recollection.
Was
Correct me
before
if
they
I'm wrong,
leave
colleagues.
School or
Before the student arrives home.
Yeah. Okay. Do you remember which? I don't remember. What policy
Maybe.
that was.
I believe that was either the bullying and harassment policy, or it could have been, I believe that was the policy. I believe it was 2.70 that we had that discussion on. If it occurs during the school day, that notification happens prior to the end of the school day, and if it's after hours, it occurs, I don't remember if it was on the same day or as soon as reasonably possible.
It was before the student goes home and tells the
Yes.
parent.
Right.
Within what is reasonably possible. Obviously, there might be an occasion where you can't get a hold of someone, but you've made a good faith attempt. Otherwise, the situation, the maintenance of the school gets significantly higher when the student goes home and tells the parents their version of what was going on, which is obviously their reality, their perception, but it's up to us as the professionals and the adults to tell the whole picture of what occurred and how we handled it.
So this is, so this is for a threat assessment. I understand this is at the state level. I think, and where we started was anytime I see like reasonable in policy, there's usually, so it gives some flexibility, but there are certain ones where I find it doesn't, we could improve upon it. The one question I have, because this is the definitions page, how it applies in each scenario throughout the policy is what I want to just make sure if we have a finite time of before they go home or whatever the appropriate language was, that it is applicable within this context. So perhaps a revisit. I can reread it and then.
Yeah, just to add a little clarity, I think too, as depending on the level of threat,
Right.
as you go through the policy, like if it's an imminent threat, obviously that would be an immediate contact, which is outlined on page 6 for D. That may vary a little bit depending if it's a low level threat. So I think the definition of reasonability, it depends on the type of threat that we're looking at. So I'm comfortable with it being in the definitions page. If we want to delineate a little more specifically around the level of threat, like when an imminent threat, we would say within 24 hours, within the school day, whatever we feel comfortable with as it relates to the specific type of threat that we're referring to.
So just to clarify, item H would remain under the link. So item H would the definition for reasonable effort to notify the exercise reasonable diligence and care to make contact with the student's parent or guardian, typically through. And that's why I don't like all this language. This again, you didn't write this. This is from the state. I don't like it. So typically through, typically through the contact information shared by the parent or guardian with the school or school district, the SBTMT chair or designee must document all attempts to make contact with the parent or guardian. I like the last part. So you're saying remain that way, and then as we flip through, based on the threat level, because there are 3, if I'm correct, I believe, right? Low, medium, and then. Okay, so low, level, medium. Then through, when it's broken down, we should look at maybe specifying it.
So specifically on page 6, if you see, just in terms of, let's see what number we're at.
I think you could have
There's a
some-
couple reasons. And that's why I'm glad we do. I would hold, because if you do really read through this, it's even identifying who specifically would be contacted as, right? So the threat may not apply to everyone. I just want to make sure of not changing the language where it could have an adverse effect, right?
I think you could, if you wanted to make it more narrow, you could say something like, as soon as reasonably possible under the particular circumstances. And I think that would give you the flexibility, yet kind of set the stage that it's a priority to make contact in that way.
I'm going to have us keep going. I'm going to pull this aside just to try to find a way to get, just because I haven't read it in the context and I don't want to say 24 hours. I know where we landed on the bullying and harassment and understanding the emphasis. And then once we pull it out, if there are any changes, we will let the board know. So that way, or does that work? I just feel like I don't want to hold us up, but yeah, go ahead.
One of the things that frustrates me is that when there's threats, regardless of the level, is that we as a board typically get notified, but then it's never resolved as a board. And then I wonder, does it get resolved to the community? And often I see on social media, oh, this is what happened, and it's wrong. So that's what I'm trying to say about a communications plan, that there should be something official that comes from the communications department when there's a threat assessment that this is what happens. It goes here, 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 closed.
Well, I don't disagree. I agree. And I think that, and while we have improved dramatically our communications, what I do think if we had a process that's transparent to even to the public, because what is probably, I believe many of the district will find this most challenging is certainly because in the event it moves to a criminal investigation, we're so limited at what we can share. If we're having some kind of communication plan that really articulates that, we are proactively sharing that there may be a point at which we can say it is now under investigation. We can't really proceed further with more information, but yeah.
And they know that.
Yeah, I like that idea. That's pretty good. Yes, yes, yes.
And I do believe there is a potential in item number 7, bullet number 7 on page 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, that each threat management team shall identify members of the school community to whom threatening behavior should be reported and provide guidance. We could probably put a timeline on that with, based on the various threat levels, the notifications happen in A, B, and C. And then in the item below it, 8A, where an imminent threat to life or physical safety exists, school personnel must immediately report the matter to law enforcement. So we have the timeline there, but we could probably get a little bit more specific above that.
Yeah, I mean, if you guys don't mind taking a little bit of shot at it and just give it back to us, then I think just anytime I see reasonable and when it has a high risk factor involved,
That's where we get into whose interpretation is what.
Yeah, but I'll defer, I mean, because that includes law enforcement. There's elements that I think people at the table need to weigh in versus us saying it, so.
Well, and again, safety first.
Yep.
Obviously, you don't want to jeopardize safety at the expense of notification and things like that. Every situation is going to be
As
different.
scenarios,
So
right.
I think you want some flexibility in the approach because you're not going to be able to dictate in advance exactly what's occurred, and you might have to do something else first for some other reason other than parental contact.
Yeah.
But
Well, I don't, yeah, that's a good point. So if there is a way to fine tune it, and then I do think my question would be to Mr. Edwards' point of, I like the idea of a communication plan. I'm not sure, is that something we would include in the policy?
It doesn't have to be, it's just a match.
Okay. Very good. Moving on.
Moving on to the next policy, 3.14, that is the district's suicide prevention policy. We update definitions with new DOE rule and state statute, update the training requirements and the student education requirements. We also included some revisions to the suicide prevention procedures and accompanied those procedures with this policy, just so that we can show that those are aligned. The parental notification and consent information was added in line with state statute on this policy.
Thank you. No, this is great.
Thank you for including the procedures.
And on this policy, I will point out that on page 5, item B, just on that notification, upon report of signs of self-harm, self-injury, or suicidal ideation, the school-based mental health services providers shall notify parents of the received report. So that is upon report of those items.
Good.
They must notify parents or guardians of those items.
Well, and again, you have the same issue on this one at page 5 EA, reasonable attempt to notify. So I'm just pointing that out. That's a similar term. If you want us to take a look at that, we can look at that too.
No, but I think that they say upon attempt, shall notify upon, well, shall upon notification, right? So where was that, E?
Yes, ma'am. Upon report of signs of self-harm, self-injury, or suicidal ideation.
So that means, to me, that means immediately. Like, am I wrong? The E in there is in the event they must be notified as soon as possible, unless notification withheld, delayed because of principal designee has object. Okay, I think that stipulates.
Item E says, when the suicide risk assessment results in the initiation of an involuntary examination for the Baker Act, the school's principal or his or her designee is required. So we can, if you'd like, clean that up to, again, say, upon the initiation of an involuntary examination, the school's principal shall notify.
Again, it's still the same reasonable attempt to notify, and what does that mean? And that can mean different things too.
I know I think where we were, and again, if we're comparing it to the harassing and bullying, they're a little, I mean, they're all very serious. These are levels of severity where we're trying to avoid someone not going home and then notifying this. God, that would not happen. I mean, I'm assuming, I shouldn't assume, but like, this would certainly be within reasonable, any logical person reasonable would be within like immediate or that 5 minutes, like, so not having to stipulate before the child comes home kind of scenario. Correct? Mrs. Rose?
Reasonable and reasonably immediate. I mean, I just think that there are so many things that go on in a school on a daily basis that the policy has to be
Like, this
clear.
is immediate. Like,
You don't want anything at the level of anything to do with suicide, and whether and you've made an immediate attempt to involve the parent.
and I will say, and again, this is not our school district, but there are reports of horrifically, sadly, where these things were not shared to the guardian and parent or overseeing their care. So if there's a way to emphasize but not tie their hands, so emphasizing immediately reasonable.
Well, immediate, but immediate has restrictions.
Correct.
If all reasonable attempts haven't been successful, that's all you can ask for. I mean,
Yeah.
I know that we went as far as having, the SRO go to the place of employment or social worker. I mean, we have incredible resources for that to be a successful attempt, but
Right, and that's why in the policy it documents all attempts so that we can go back and incident review. But yes, come on.
go.
Come on up, expert. That's why I was like, I don't want us to be making these in the silo here.
Ms. Coker has worked extensively with us on this policy and helped us get it to where it is.
You were talking with your body language.
Yes.
I'm glad you're up here now.
If there's any kind of clarification that I can help provide. So within that policy, when it talks about the immediate notification, within our procedures, when a student is reported of making self-harm, suicidal ideation, prior to even providing a screening to the student, our school-based mental health providers are notifying the family. Mm-hmm. So if that helps provide some clarification. I don't know if that's not clear within the policy, and if there's ways that we can tighten it up more, I mean, we're happy to do so.
I mean, I like that, but I mean, that, however it's written in that, I just didn't want it to be us being narrow-minded of scenarios because it's in policy and we have to be thoughtful of that. But however, we can emphasize that this is like immediate contact, which we know is in procedure, but I'd like that to be emulated in the policy.
So our procedure, we notify immediately, and then at that point, we move forward once the parent is notified. And if a parent happens to say, no, I don't want you to provide this screening to my child, like I do not want that, then we have opt-out letters that they come in to sign. So they have, like, the parent is driving the ship within this with any type of suicide response.
Okay.
That actually was going to be my question,
Yeah.
because I heard of a specific instance where it was reported to the parent, and the parent said, I don't want anything done. And so then what does the school or the administrator do in that process? It should be identified in the policy what the next step is.
So this is another case of where would it make sense to include procedures in our policy? I mean, because this may be answering questions and we're duplicating efforts, but
Or make a reference to where those procedures are
Right.
located.
I was going to say, to back up on that communications plan, when you said, should that be in the policy?
Right.
I think we should
Reference it.
in the policy.
procedure.
See attached communications plan.
okay. That's fine, because again, there's a process to which unraveling, or like when you continuous improvement, so if you have your procedures and there's an ability to improve upon them, having them in the policies you can't react as quickly, and I don't want to take that away. So for that reason, I would be fine with seeing referenced procedures, and there you have both the various paths
An immediate link.
immediately.
Yeah,
An immediate link to the
immediate link.
procedures.
Immediate.
Just
There has
click
to
on the
be,
link.
there has to be something, because when, from a former counselor perspective, and Mandy, we don't really have time to start clicking on different things to go check here, go check here, go check here. So if it is going to be part of the procedure or policy, however you write it, I think it needs to be there, because that is a protection for the school and the district, that parent has said no. And I think it needs to be in this, because there are parents that say no and have said no for many, 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 many years. That is a huge thing, because that's in the documentation then. So I just think when you start saying click here, click there, it can get lost.
Well, you make a good point on again, this is policy. When I think of staff, which I'm sure reference policy, I'm also thinking public facing, similar to kind of the communication plan we talked about. But understanding this scenario, if this, then this, to include if a legal guardian or parent denies any kind of additional services.
It's documented in.
Well, there are forms that we have that lay the whole thing out, that we've drafted, that are multiple pages, single space, that talk about putting the parent on notice of all the risks, and really laying out that the parent is refusing to consent to the services we're trying to provide. And that is within the parental bill of rights to,
Right.
frankly, allow the parent to do that. But we put them more than on notice of, what could happen.
I guess my point, and then kind of my thought, is that we would include procedures. They're titled procedures, therefore they don't go the same rulemaking process as from the board. But that when we're publishing these, particularly from a digital standpoint, we have the procedures that staff has directly attached and a communication plan, right? So that they're all right there for anyone to see, if that, then this. And I think, so instead of worrying about the language specifically in certain elements, I think procedures would make sense to include. Yes?
That was my whole thing of always wanting to have the procedures, not for the board to micromanage.
But being titled
But
procedures.
it's titled, and it's right there for anybody to look it up and see.
I like that. Is that doable? Yeah.
Yeah, and I think we have those currently posted on our website with the policy, and
policy?
the procedure, right?
Yeah,
So
you
suicide
probably
prevention
do.
specifically has
'Cause there's so
the
much.
suicide prevention policy, and then
Okay.
right underneath that policy is the link for the suicide prevention procedure.
Perfect.
Which outlines
We
that.
just, so good. All right, well, you guys are ahead.
That's this document right here, right?
Correct.
That's what this is,
Correct.
Which I think does accompany the policy.
Yeah, I think that's it's great.
Wait a minute.
We do, and we did just update that on the website
Okay.
within the last month or so. The procedures that were on there were outdated and not the ones that we're currently using, so we made sure to get the active.
Well, and that's another
Procedures
reason to have them
right
together,
there.
because then it doesn't fall through.
All right,
the
well,
cracks.
thank you guys. We're one step. It just took us for a minute. Thank you.
And just if I could just reiterate, even if a parent, we end up opting out of a screener, our school staff, our school-based mental health providers still work very closely with the parent to ensure that a safety plan is put in place for their child, just to ensure that they are at school, they're safe, and they're supported, which is also outlined in our procedures and on that opt-out notification. That they
Thank you.
Well done.
Thank you, thank you. Okay, sorry about the deferment there. All right. We're on what,
5.31, that is the student detention search and seizure policy. Some of the new language in here comes directly from state statute, that any search must be done discreetly to maintain the privacy of the student's personal items, and adds language from the state that any personal items that are not prohibited must be immediately returned to the student's personal belongings. We also added a line that if a child refuses a search by a school administrator, they may be subject to discipline within the Code of Student Conduct due to insubordination, and that prior to a return to school, the student and their parent or legal guardian must participate in a re-entry conference where a safety plan will be created.
I see no, okay.
Next policy is 6.29, report of misconduct. This was a change in legislation, and part of it is more incumbent on the law enforcement agency. However, the new language says that a law enforcement agency shall, within 48 hours, notify the district superintendent when an employee is arrested for a felony or a misdemeanor involving the abuse of a minor child or the sale or possession of a controlled substance, and that within 24 hours after that notification, a school principal or designee shall notify parents or guardians of enrolled students who had direct contact with the employee, and that notification must include at a minimum the name and specific charges against that employee. Next policy is 4.20, instructional materials selection and objection to use. This is a policy that we discussed at a previous workshop, but we went back through and made a lot of revisions, almost started from scratch just to make sure that this policy was very clear, very aligned with state statute and the requirements that we have there. We've updated so that it's in line with the legislative changes the last two sessions, outlining the process for the evaluation and the selection of instructional materials, including the roles and responsibilities for the review committee and the members, detailing the process for who can object to adoptions of instructional materials, as well as how they can do that objection, describing the process for who can object to specific instructional materials and how they can object, and formalizing the district review committee composition, the responsibilities, and the procedures for review and for hearings. And I will say that I believe it was the last DOE meeting, they provided the standard state form for those objections to instructional materials. So we have worked internally with staff to make sure that we have those forms updated and ready for use here within the district. Final policy is 4.22, library media center material selection and objection to use. I do know, board, we had a second version of this policy that we provided to you as early as possible, which happened to be yesterday due to receiving it, I believe, on the day before Thanksgiving, and working with Mr. Duggan and the superintendent through the weekend to make sure that we had looked at some of the suggestions and recommendations so that we could incorporate them if they were needed. And what this policy does is it updates, again, our definitions in line with legislative changes, outlines the opt-out process for school or classroom libraries and media centers, details how consideration should be given for the selection of school and classroom library materials, and formalizes the process for challenging those materials, the review committee responsibilities, and the procedures for reviews and for hearings.
I'm sorry, I know this was brought forward. We had a group. Who was the group? What group came forward?
So we wrote this policy, and from my perspective, I always welcome input from
Yeah, of
all
course.
various
Yeah.
stakeholders. So I'm appreciative of their efforts here. It was a group called the Florida Freedom to Read Project, and they came forward with a written letter that was distributed attached to this revised policy that we sent out yesterday. I learned of it, I think, on Thanksgiving Day. I think it came in either Tuesday or Wednesday, right before Thanksgiving. So we worked on this over the weekend and mostly yesterday, which is why you only got it yesterday to finalize it. They made 15 or 16 suggestions. frankly, some of which were good suggestions, and we incorporated into this revised policy. Many of them we accepted verbatim. Some of them we accepted in spirit. So I'd say the overwhelming majority of them we said, yeah, it's a good idea. And we put it in there. A couple of them we disagreed with and said, no, our language is fine. And then there were a couple spots where there's legitimate policy debates, and I look for some guidance from you all as part of this discussion about what you wish for this policy to look at. And if I may kind of walk you through what I think the big one is from this group is, so over the last two legislative sessions, 22 and 23, there was significant changes in this arena of, library materials. And even within the correspondence from this outside group, the Florida Freedom to Read Project, even they acknowledge there's a lot of ambiguity in this area, and it's not super clear in some places about, what exactly, there's not like a model policy, for example, on this. So there's some flexibility for you all to direct us on what you wish the policy to look at. And I will tell you, I think the big one that they kind of point out that I look for guidance on is, do you want to have the ability for the trained media specialists to remove books informally, or do you want every book challenge, every objection that's raised to come before this board? Sounds easy enough to decide. I can tell you it's a little unclear from the legislation, and I'll give you an example. Within that legislation, there is the ability to weed your garden every day, right? To be able to say, just go through a random library and say, I think this book doesn't meet the criteria, and remove it, right? Without bringing it to the board's attention. I think you have to do reporting to DOE on an annual basis on that. So that's permitted. Now, what's unclear in the statute is whether when someone objects, whether you're allowed to go through that same process, or when someone objects, does that make a different process that's more formal that has to come before you? I can tell you some districts have been totally hijacked by book challenges. We've been pretty fortunate in this district through the use of good common sense procedures, I think, where we really have only had one formal challenge. I can tell you some districts have had hundreds, and if you had hundreds of challenges coming in here every day, it would kind of hijack everything that you are doing and all the progress we're making in different areas. That being said, there's an argument under the statute that you should be bringing them here. So that's really what we look for guidance for on this topic.
If I may,
Please.
I want to provide a recommendation on this particular issue. We need to, in my opinion, allow our certified media specialists to continue to weed through the process. It's a natural part of the process that
100%.
has existed since the onset of libraries. And I think if we start diving into, just making the decision to remove maybe an antiquated book that hadn't been checked out
Right.
in many, many years, and we want to refresh our libraries, by that being removed and then having to come to the board for that removal would be an inundation and really would take up all of your time. So
Yeah,
that's my
agree.
recommendation.
That's one scenario. Mrs. Rose, you had another?
I just want to say thank you for that recommendation. We have staff highly trained for a reason in those roles, and I thank you for that recommendation.
So there's the regular, yes, so there should be the ability for the media specialist to certainly continue there. The question, I think, is at hand is in the event of I may be wrong, in the event of if it's a formal, so because we'll use the one scenario that happened here. It wasn't a formal complaint, actually. It was someone made it, they didn't go through the process. It was a constituent, made people aware of it. They was reviewed and pursuant to current statute applied where it could be removed for I don't remember what, for pornographic purposes or whatever, I don't remember what the language was. And so there is the question of, that's where I think the gray area is was the action of removing it, was that really the weeding process, or did they become aware? I will say personally, because there are a lot of books, and I don't know, there was a lot of scrutiny in the past over the last couple of years or so, or whatever, in multiple districts, that there have been some that if it should be able to be removed, if it falls within the statutory allowances, then does that go to the board through challenge or not? Because I think we're talking about an informal awareness of something that someone's technically objecting to, but they're not going through the formal process. Am I right? I mean,
So I would say in that particular instance, there are many times where, and I've experienced this, where a book that may be more suited for a high school level ends up in a middle school school or ends up in an elementary. So it'd be age inappropriate, right? And so when that is brought to the attention of the media specialist, maybe through a parent, that media specialist is making the determination that that book should be weeded from there. And that is an informal, it's not a challenge, it's a conversation with the media specialist, and I think we want to continue to have that latitude for that. I would say the trigger for that is the form that the state has provided. That is when it constitutes the objection, and then it would go through that process and may end up at the board for a final decision. Other than that, if it's an informal conversation and the media specialist, I think we give them the latitude to use their expertise to say, hey, this book's not appropriate for this grade level. You're right, we're going to remove that book or weed it out of our library.
I concur with that. Yes, yeah, Mr. Edwards, and then.
Wow, there's a lot there. One is we absolutely want to follow statute. Two, I get highly concerned when I hear ambiguity, because a lot of conversation is that that's deliberate. And what I'm concerned about is that when there is like equipment or buildings that go out of service, we get a form as board members that said, here are the buildings that are coming out of service, and we approve it. And so when a book or materials are not checked out for many years and it goes through a natural process, I think that's easy to say, we don't need to see that. But when it's a conversation that this is not age appropriate, I'm a little concerned about that, because if I look at what's on this document that was edited, right here, we took out with diversity of appeal. And the word diversity is a word that everyone's all concerned about, and it's what was edited right here on the original 4.22. Yeah, and it's in blue, and it just merely meant a wide range of topic. But it got edited, because perhaps it got edited because of the word diversity. And what I'm a little concerned about is self-editing, banning, I don't want to see that happen. And the ambiguity puts fear into people, and that's what my concern is. And I'm so appreciative of the fact that we haven't had challenges, and I'm proud to tell constituents that all the time, that we haven't had that, and that's not who Sarasota is. But I don't want to see self-selection and self-removal because people might be afraid of something. That's what my concern is.
May I?
Mrs. Rose.
Superintendent Connor, do we still have the flexibility of our school-based staff if indeed, in this particular example, I think this conversation has potential to help a deeper understanding, if a book is in middle school and it is actually matched more to the developmental level of a 9th or 11th grade, that goes with parent permission, and it's not necessarily banning a book. It's letting a parent know that this could contain material that is for an older age group. I know we used to do that. We would keep those books and only offer them with the parents knowing what their child was reading.
To your point, I would say I would want to rely on the expertise of a certified media specialist who has been specifically trained, who has been educated on the appropriateness of the book selection and the collections within the library. So in the instance where we may have a book that may be, there's some variance or a decision determining whether that book belongs at middle school, because we have professional reviews, we have a lot of different sources that we can cite. But it's the expertise that I think I don't want to cut off in this process by challenging a book or not allowing them to utilize their expertise in deciding that. And that's what they've been trained for. And so we have that is an aspect that I think we've got to give them the flexibility to weed through. It's not necessarily out of fear, but to leverage and to rely on their expertise to make those decisions.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I really love our staff too, so I'm not minimizing their expertise by any stretch of the imagination. But because there's ambiguity, that I think it requires, and what my concern is that can one parent or one constituent ask that question and then cause a whole grade level in that media center to have to seek parent permission. That's it's one person causing a whole domino effect. And that's what my concern is, that self-editing, self-selection, or better safe than sorry when it wasn't.
If I may, because I understand where you're coming from, I think that if it is allowable under the media specialists understand the parameters, because they have been more defined and they're ambiguous, and I know that's been a topic of, is that good or bad, or is it intentional or not? So I'm going to say for Sarasota, having this conversation and then relying on the leadership of our superintendent and the other academic leaders to give our educators comfort of, these are where the lines are, we trust you, et cetera, and then these are the processes. If there is someone that comes forward, this person in this title has the authority to do X, right? And I think, because I think we don't want that fear thought, because I think there's a lot of headlines that provoke that, but we're having this conversation now, and hopefully through the communication that's truly the intent here, and giving the authority of the media specialist to do so. I would say that my guess, and I'm trying to think how you would caveat this, but is that there won't be a reaction if it is found to be completely out of range, inappropriate for X, but this in the reading lexile of, because that's where you tend to see, well, that's usually the issue, right? So that it has more mature content, but the student has a more advanced reading capability. So that's where do you put that? And that's where I thought you were mentioning is our educators know those. They have, like, my daughter's about to read Tom Sawyer. We got a heads up on certain things. Yes. Like, it's just the heads up, right? So those aren't unusual circumstances that I think have been, but I think it's not bad to reiterate, are those being practiced? Because it goes both ways. We want to make sure parents have a heads up so they're engaged in the learning process, but we also want to make sure that one doesn't, because everyone, again, I think all parents, and this is where I truly believe, and I think everyone here agrees with this, is that parents should be the ones to dictate that, and one parent shouldn't preclude another from necessarily having access to that. So, but then inside there's the general responsibility of the board, the district, to have some vetting ability. I mean, I think where it stands now is it does really afford that. The only final question I have is, in the usual process of weeding out, because they're an owned asset of the district, is there not a report that you pull that? No? Okay. I don't know what that looks like, so I don't want to.
Maybe I could bring some clarity by walking you through what the current draft says so you can understand what's in this, and if you want us to make any tweaks, we can. But the first step would be a parent would informally complain to a principal, and the principal would then explain to the parent, hey, what the process is, this is how we select the books, and if it ended there, that's fine. That would be informal. If the parent was not satisfied at that stage, they could fill out the form, right? And then it would go to the trained media specialist, who would then be able to review it and say, you're right, this is pornography. If it got resolved at that point, that would be the end of it without board involvement. And that's what I want to make clear. If the parent continued to be unhappy, it would then be appealed to a district committee that got put together that has public meetings, and then a district committee would weigh in, and then ultimately that parent would have the ability to continue to appeal to this board for a formal decision. So it takes away, it unclogs this boardroom, and it allows the district people with training and specialization to handle it. But here's where the weakness is, and I think that's, in full disclosure, I want you guys to understand, is that the parent objecting, this is a process for someone to complain. There's not a process through these more informal steps for somebody else who disagrees with that parent, meaning somebody comes in and says, I object to Tom Sawyer, and then there's a screening process of, should we remove Tom Sawyer? At these informal layers, there's no process for a parent to come in and say, I want there to be Tom Sawyer for my kid, right? That's what we're talking about here is, if you, the special magistrate process that is designed to be a neutral appeal after the board takes action is only statutorily available if the board takes action. That is triggered, the special magistrate process where somebody neutral gets to come in and decide is triggered by board action. These informal steps that would happen prior to board action would not permit that remedy to be available to a parent who wants their kid to have a book that somebody else's parent doesn't want their own kid and thus everybody else to have. That's the issue. If you go through board action, it theoretically permits a parent to essentially appeal the removal that another parent wants.
I can't imagine that in any decision-making in a organization and in this school district, if there's ambiguity at any level, that person decides on that would go up the ladder to have more organizational intent, more legal intent, so that decision wasn't being made by one person. That is how this district at its ideal framework, organizational structure has functioned. So I refer to our superintendent for that.
No, thank you. That was actually on top of mind. I think to address Mr. Edwards' point, because there will be times where you get to a point, there will be very clear distinctions that that book probably needs to be weeded out or moved to another level. And then there's going to be times where it's like, oh, that's a close one. I don't know. Age developmental appropriate is a tough definition. It is ambiguous. And that has been a struggle through this entire process. In those cases, and I think we can do a good job of reiterating this with our media specialists, that when we get to a point where it's very close and it's hard to determine, then we need to go to the more formal process and then bring it to the district review committee where you have more eyes, more ears to make a determination, and then potentially go up to the board to make a final decision to address that ambiguity.
For me, then, and I'm trying to find the reasonable solution to this conversation. Where I'm concerned is the transparency of the removal of that book from that library or to that age category, and where will that data or where will that information be housed, so that we don't find out, 2 years from now, hey, these 3 books should never have been removed, and we can go back and find what the process was, so it's transparent.
That doesn't currently exist in terms of tracking that, but we could now.
This law didn't exist.
Right. Now with the classroom library scanning process, and I'll give the board an update around that as well, because I know that we've been waiting intently on that. I think we could create, because now you'll have within every school, you'll have a printed list of books. We'll know what exists in there. So I'll give an update on that once we get through that, so you know where we're at in the scanning process and how that goes. But I think we would have to create a procedure for that. Honestly, that does not exist currently.
Well, then should this wait until, because
I think we can create procedures outside of the policy. The policy is very statutorily driven.
Right.
I think where we're trying to come to an agreement on is what triggers.
Balance the transparency of it. I don't think it would change the true legalities of it, but I see your point, and my question would be is, even if it, because the way it's defined, it does to have the certified media specialist, that would ultimately be the first person at bat, right, that would review it. And it would be interesting to see, because this is very similarly as, how often do we have this issue in Sarasota County schools? Because there are some counties that they are being inundated, and to my knowledge, because I've asked this before, it's not that frequent. I want, without understanding what that workload would be like, I would be curious of what does that look like if every time that occurs, not so some laborious paperwork, but some kind of note. I think for you, actually, you'd probably want to be aware of that full visibility of either whatever, that you'd be notified. It not necessarily eliminate their ability to make that decision, but allows at least your awareness. I'm open to
Well, and the way with the policy is currently written, if the specialist removes the book, they're required to write documentation of what the rationale was consistent with the standard. So theoretically, there'll be a document that the media specialist fills out that kind of writes up that, hey, this book was determined wasn't age appropriate, was pornographic, was involved
Right.
sexual conduct that's not permitted, those type of things. What we might do, and this I'm thinking out loud right now, is maybe at that layer, in the event that happens, have another layer of review of the superintendent or his designee, just as a safeguard to make sure, hey, that was a sound decision by the media specialist, so that's not a one-person decision, something like that, for example. And then this group, to this point, is also seeking greater notification. Perhaps there's a part of our webpage we can say, hey, here's books that were removed, or, whatever. I don't know how you do that without, but these are all the issues that this group was raising.
If your new system has a place, well, then that information goes to a file that's available to the board, that's available to the public, that I'm fine with that, because then people have an understanding that book got removed, and here's why. And it's, it didn't have to have a fanfare, it didn't have a board discussion, it just got removed, and it got moved into that file, which is accessible to the public and to the board.
We can definitely take a look at that, to add that as a procedure. I honestly can't answer that question right now to know if it has that capability, but we can definitely take a look at it.
If I may, one other thing to your point, Mr. Edwards, about the removal of diversity, I just want to point out that it was just kind of moved to a different place under the definition of age appropriate, which is in, let me find it here. It is, let me see, because I know there's a couple different versions, but it's in Roman numeral 3D.
It's in this one.
4.
This version.
Yes, 3D4.
The green version.
I can tell you if it's the one that has the yellow highlighting on it.
Yeah.
It's at the top. It's at the very bottom of page 2 of 11 and the top of page 3 of 11, and that is the definition that was used in a DOE PowerPoint on this back in February of 23. We took the exact language that DOE used when talking about what age and grade appropriate means. And you'll see there that it includes the consideration of the accurate portrayal of the state's broad racial, ethnic, socioeconomic, and cultural diversity without bias or indoctrination.
Awesome.
No, and I think we've come a long way, and I know there's been a lot of work at this, but I think that to that point of the digitizing process, going through everything, adding media specialists, getting this tightened up, whatever this is, there is a written format, some way in which so that there is some, because it's a public record, of course, and so avoiding that, there's nothing to hide. I think it's a good balancing act. So, okay.
So yeah, so thank you, everybody. I know you just got this yesterday. This is a complicated topic with lots of different opinions on. I have no preference. I hope I didn't give you anything that would suggest I have a preference. But honestly, take a deep look at this. Like, it's a worthy thing to consider.
No, I think everyone's coming at it in good faith, and that's what matters. So, okay.
That was it. That was number
Rock and
20
roll.
of
Good job.
number 20 of 20. So we got through them all.
Awesome. That is exciting. Well,
And
we
I
left
think it was
save the
just-
best for last.
We were just over an hour. So.
Okay. And did you? Are we doing the library update? You said you're going to give us an update on that, or not library, but the media review. What did you just say you were going to give us an update on?
Oh,
Never
yes,
mind.
thank
I
you,
thought
thank you,
said
thank you.
that,
The
right?
cataloging of the
Cataloging.
Absolutely, yes, thank you. So classroom library scanning, just to give the board an update where we're at right now. So all of our schools, K-5, 26 schools, have their initial classroom library scanning completed. Our principals will be notified through our AWN, which is our administrative weekly newsletter, this week, that and through our virtual call that we have bi-monthly on Monday, about where we're headed. So we're going to go live to share the school scan libraries on Monday, December 4th. And it will be on our district and individual school websites per statute. And families will be notified via our EdConnect email notification. Opt-out forms for students' access to media centers and the classroom library books, which is required by law, will be available to parents through our district and individual school websites as well, and will be included in the family email notification, and this will be sent to all K-12 families. Want to give you an update on our Insignia pilot. Yeah, Insignia is it's not as been successful as I think it was anticipated. This company was a startup company out of Canada, and it's just really hasn't been able to deliver programmatically of what they promised in terms of email notifications to parents when a book is checked out. So we're making the decision to halt that pilot at this point. So it's at the 6 schools. So what we're going to do is there's a silver lining here. We do have Destiny, which has been a long-standing textbook library media inventory program, has the capability to do what we want with Insignia now. So we're hopeful that we'll be able to continue to deliver on what we wanted with
We had to
Insignia.
play a little hardball. We looked like we were about to leave, and they're like, we actually can do it. So.
Yes. So we're working through that process, and so now that they've added that component, we're gonna move forward. So that's where we're at right now. Anything else I missed on that? You're all good?
Great.
All right.
Wow, that was good. Good,
Okay.
good. Made me sad, and then I got happy again.
So we
All
should
right.
be in full compliance with our legislation related to classroom libraries and having that publicly available as of December 4th.
All right. Great work, guys. I appreciate it. And thank you, board, for hanging in there with us. So that concludes the second item. I know we had lunch scheduled for 1 o'clock. Mrs. Tompkins, is it? So we will break until, do you guys need a full hour? Do you need a full hour for lunch? I want to be respectful, but, so what time is it? How much? 2 o'clock? 40 minutes? 50 minutes? 40 minutes. 2 o'clock. So we will resume here. We'll break for lunch now, and then we will reconvene at 2 o'clock for the final segment.